Good afternoon. Just to check, you all able to see and hear me well?
I can hear you, Commissioner Gilman.
Thanks so much for confirming. Appreciate it. All right. Well, I'm going to kick off our workshop. Good afternoon. It is February 12th, 2024 at 1 p.m. And we are here hosting a workshop in proceeding number 23M-0464EG, which is the matter of implementation of Senate Bill 23-291. My name is Megan Gilman, and I'm serving as the hearing commissioner for this matter for the commission. Just to introduce, as I went through at our workshop last Monday on the 5th, we're having a series of workshops within this proceeding to identify and have some discussion on some of the issues that we're seeing, especially as it relates to interconnection or ability to get new loads served, especially on Public Service Company Colorado distribution system for the electric system. So happy to have you all with us today. The intent of today's workshop specifically is really to talk primarily with Public Service Company of Colorado's employees to better understand some of the issues that have been occurring. So my plan was really to start out by understanding from their representatives an identification of the areas where we're seeing capacity constraints on the electric system serving Colorado. Then I think we'll move into a discussion on the history of some of these issues, kind of when they were identified by the company and perhaps in more depth, as well as any relationship to the 2023 DSP. Then talk about some next steps for what the company is planning with regard to some of these capacity constraints or issues on the system. And then as our final step, I wanted to kind of zoom out and look at the bigger picture in terms of how, if it's possible to anticipate some of these things more in advance or take kind of different measures to ensure that we don't fall behind with our ability to host either new load or new DERs. So anyway, thank you again for joining us. Maybe what I'll have us do is have Public Service Company of Colorado representatives take your cameras on, and whoever's kind of running point on this, introduce whoever's here from your team to help us, maybe as a first step, and then we can launch into that first section.
Yeah, thank you very much, Commissioner Gilman. This is Stephen Martz with Xcel Energy and Public Service Company in Colorado. I'm the Vice President of Integrated Planning. And with me today, we've got several folks from our distribution planning, strategy, and regulatory teams. So Stephen Berman, who's our Regional Vice President of Rates and Regulatory for PSCO. Zach Pollock, who's the Director of Grid Strategy and Emerging Technologies. And David Mino, who manages our distribution system planning organization.
That's great. Sorry, I was taking notes. I know who to go to with any questions as they come up. Excellent. So Mr. Martz, the way I was hoping to start out is to just kind of set the stage. I think the commission began hearing in the fall about issues with certain customers trying to get connected to Public Service Company of Colorado's electric system, I should say, and having complications with the readiness of the local distribution system to accommodate their loads. And so wanted to first kind of set the stage and get perspective from you all on where you're having these areas of capacity constraints. And maybe you can lead us through each. I'm honestly not even aware how many areas there are. So, I really just want to understand kind of the scale and scope of the issue with you today. And so if you can take me through each of those areas that are experiencing capacity constraints, maybe one by one, with whatever detail you have. If you have maps, sizes kind of physically, as well as shortfall of maybe capacity, hosting ability, duration, how long these issues have lasted. I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Maybe it's from you, Mr. Martz. Maybe you can just mute while I'm speaking.
Any better?
Maybe. Okay, we'll see.
I'll go on mute and we'll try to manage it that way.
Yeah, no worries. It can be hard to tell where it's coming from. And then, the duration of whatever issue has been experienced, as well as what you all kind of most immediately are planning to do, any cost or timeline to mediate. So that was my plan to get us started, just to give me better perspective on these issues. To the extent you have any maps or visuals, we can probably enable you to share. I just want to be sure I really have a good scope of understanding of what we're talking about as far as these constraints.
Sure, happy to, Commissioner Goldman. And I think maybe the best place to start is we did prepare in advance a presentation of materials that I think gets to most of the questions that you've put out on the table for us to consider. I think we have most of that prepared, and so I think if it works for you, that's what I propose we do. And kind of the agenda that we had kind of set forth in the presentation is to kind of walk through the history and evolution of our distribution system and our planning construct, kind of the current state of where the system's at, the challenges and opportunities that we have. I think that's a little bit of the tactile detail you're looking for. And then we wanted to kind of end, at least the prepared remarks, of course, with, what we're thinking about in terms of solutions, mitigations, and what I'll call kind of thematic issues, which we hope to address in DSP in the kind of longer term. So as we see it, there's definitely a cycle here. I mean, there's certainly some acute pain. And I just wanted to, state on record, we listened with intent last week. I was pretty silent, right? You heard from a lot of other members from PSCO, but I listened to the entire 4 to 5 hours, however long it ended up being, and that certainly didn't fall on deaf ears. So I just want to recognize, we certainly hear from our customers there's acute issues. So we wanted to offer kind of a conversation teeing up just the thematic level issues, but also the tactile piece that you're looking for. Would that be amenable?
Yeah, I think that certainly works, just to the extent, and probably has a good framing and kind of how you do things and understanding some of it. I just want to make sure we do get some specific detail about where are we experiencing problems, because I lack that perspective, and I think would very much benefit from understanding kind of how many places, what scale, what is our timeline. So long as we do have some pretty specific information about the areas of the acute pain, I think, as you pointed out,
Yep.
that certainly works for me. And I'll follow up with questions in the specific areas as we go forth. Let me know. I can probably write questions down as you go. If something seems like pressing and we'll move off it, maybe I'll just alert you and ask a question while you're going.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly fine. I mean, we're happy to kind of present in an overly formal manner, but I think, we can use a casual tone and just talk through it with you and to work through your questions as they come up. And if there's anything that, you're saving for the end, we can always circle back and talk about that. In regard to kind of getting into the detail around locations, some of that we did come prepared with tables of where we've seen issues. We do have some separate maps that we've prepared on a confidential basis, just because right now where we're at is we don't have the security requirements fully established to share publicly, but certainly hear your desire to see some of that. And so we'll work with commission staff to get those in front of you.
Okay, yeah, and to the extent that obviously there are a lot of customers or prospective customers that they may be interested in this issue. To whatever extent you can non-confidentially share the scope, the area, kind of, that would be helpful. I want myself as well as others to get the context for what we're dealing with. So in whatever way you can do that non-confidentially during the session, that would be.
Sure. Yeah, I think what we prepared for you, Commissioner, is about that 10,000 foot level, right? So we can get you some details to kind of think locationally around where this is, without getting into customer request specifics and things like that, which also have some confidentiality challenges. So if that works, we did email the presentation to Casey Federico and Ron Davis. I'm not sure if they have the ability to pull that up for the Zoom meeting here. If not, we could do that on our end.
Commissioner Gilman, I made Emily Giraldo a co-host to share her screen today for this.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think we got it minutes before this, so it's probably best to have your team run it. It sounds like y'all have that ability with Ms. Giraldo.
Yeah, if you could give us just a minute to sort that out, Commissioner Gilman, we'll get that going.
Yep, take a minute.
Oh, hi there. This is Ms. Giraldo, and I'm wondering if Zach Pollock could have permission to share the presentation.
Sure,
Ms.
you can do
Enrico,
that.
I can email you his email address.
I just have to do it on the screen. You said Zach Pollock? Okay, he's set up now.
Yes. Okay, I think we've sorted out our technical challenges. I think that's not too bad for on the fly. Just want to confirm with you, Commissioner, that you can see the screen and you can still hear me.
Yes, I can.
Okay, wonderful. All right, well, let's go ahead and get into it, and we can advance to the next slide, please. I kind of previewed this before a few minutes ago, but here's the agenda that we're thinking. Again, I think this is somewhat casual in the sense of we're happy to explore various areas as we work through this. The slide deck today is about 20 slides or so, hitting on a number of different issues, and so we can work through your questions as they arise, Commissioner. And like I said, we'll of course reserve time at the end to hit anything that we didn't get to. So starting with the beginning, we thought that was kind of important to review, how has the grid really been designed over the last 80 to 100 years? I mean, I have an engineering background and basis, and I think you guys all know by title, right, what our new integrated system planning organization does. Our job is to fully integrate how we think about resource planning, transmission, distribution, and gas planning all together. So as you all have seen, our electric resource plan, our clean heat plans, our gas cases, et cetera, that's all coming from my team, and we've fully consolidated all of that together now. And so what I think about in terms of the history here is, the system is designed to do a certain set of things, right? Just like a car is designed to do multiple things, right? There's design basis of the system. We thought it was important to kind of visit on the history and the evolution and kind of literally what's changed on a thematic basis, just because there actually, as we see it, there's a number of parallels to where we've been at with this grid in the past and then where we're going. And part of our focus with this as well is to ensure that we've got the principles right, such that we're not in a quote unquote triage mode as we endure customer requests and load growth and things like that, but we're really getting the planning basis correctly aimed so that we can continue to be more proactive and meet our customers' needs as we continue. So with that, we'll kind of portend that into a discussion on the current state of the distribution system. Like I said before, I think this is where you'll get I know you'll get your kind of hands-on feel for locationally, where are we experiencing challenges with capacity, how are we thinking about customer requests, and then we'll end on solutions, mitigations, and what I really hope to do is give you a sense of where our head is at and major themes for the distribution system plan, which we are planning to file later this year. So let's move into the first topic here, and we'll spend a little bit of time on just the history and evolution. So keep going, please. So these are kind of the analogs that we see as we think back over the last 80 to 100 years of building, operating, and maintaining our grid. And the quick narrative, if you will, is, a lot of the country right before the Rural Electric Act, and then also, a lot of the infrastructure build out coming out of World War II. A lot of the country was not electrified, and that was kind of the first major infrastructure build out. So you saw this really large proliferation of electric infrastructure between the 30s and 60s. And I think the reason that this is important is because, as I think many people know, capacity really comes in large tranches, right? Just because of standardized sizes of transformers, standardized sizes of conductor, standardized sizes of poles and things like that. So that first infrastructure build out was really important, because what it did for us as a country, but also for the PSCO service territories, it really gave us a lot of margin, if you will, that allowed our customers to grow into it. So when you kind of move forward from our infrastructure build out into the kind of the first major outgrowth of electrification load, that was the air conditioning load coming on in the 1960s and 70s. And at the time, I think the kind of like the best way to think about that is that was kind of like a 1 to 2x increase in electrification, right? So we went from very simple, a handful of home appliances, basic lighting and things like that. And then in mass, a lot of our populace got air conditioning installed in their homes, right? And that was a major load factor, right? And so what happened is we ended up using up a lot of that extra margin of capacity that was available from the initial build out. And that kind of got us to a basis of using the vast majority of the infrastructure. As we kind of hit, the energy crises of the 1970s and 1980s, right, there became a lot more focus on conservation and energy efficiency. And that's what I would say is kind of like the period, or like the generation of electrical engineering that we're just kind of coming out of and about to evolve into, is this major focus on demand side management programs, demand response, and I think these are all things that our company, as well as our customers, have benefited from, is reducing, the amount of energy needed to serve, an electrified home, if you will. I think the other thing that's allowed us to do is really not have to do another large scale infrastructure build out like we saw in the 1930s and 60s. In other words, it's let us, rely on like a just in time operating model for investment, where, there really was not sizable load growth. And in the time that I've been in the power and energy sector, which is a little over 20 years now, I can tell you, large load requests used to be 1 to 2 or 3 megawatts. And now we're regularly getting in load requests upwards of 50 megawatts, 100 megawatts and more. So it's this pretty seismic shift in the overall requests that we're getting from customers. So when you kind of progress from the conservation energy efficiency generation, right, you kind of move more towards the power sector decarbonization focus, which was kind of the late 90s, I'd say, through the early 2000s. Kind of where we're at today is you saw the rollout of a lot of renewable portfolio standards, a lot of clean energy standards. And as we point out, right, we've had a carbon-free 2050 goal for several years now. And so that's kind of like the precipice that the industry is at right now, right, as we went from build out to load growth to conservation and efficiency to decarbonizing power. And now it's kind of circular. Now we're kind of back to looking more heavily at distribution, because the reality is, and I'll show this in some data in the next several slides here, is more and more of our customers are electrifying across multiple segments of their lives, right? So it's no longer basic lighting, basic air conditioning. Now it's electric vehicles. We're really contemplating through a clean heat plan. What we hope will be the proliferation of electrified space heating for our customers as well. And so that kind of takes us to this precipice point that we're on right now. So I think that's a good segue to move us into our next slide and kind of talk a little bit more in more detail about what load has looked like overall for the last several years, right? And this kind of speaks to what I was saying before around how we've seen load materialize on the system. So the way to kind of look at this graph is the black line as well as the dotted line. Those are residential energy sales on a per capita basis, and the blue line is just total volume of residential sales, right? And so if you were to only look at the blue line, it might be misleading, because there's two ways that you can really, or I should say, we really experience growth. One is through new meters onto the system, right? So that's kind of like what I call frontier expansion of the system. Basically, the system gets bigger, so it's got to serve more energy. The other piece of this, though, is that there's also electrification of existing meters, right? So that would be just what I described before: people buying EVs, electrifying space heating. And so what we've really seen is that to date, so far, a lot of the growth has been driven through like the size of the system getting bigger through new meters on the frontiers of the system. On the energy efficiency perspective, one of the things we're really proud of, and I think the commission and general the public is really proud of, is the fact that on a per capita basis overall, that's more or less gone down with time. So we just haven't really experienced a need to look at the existing feeders serving, say, like the saturated neighborhoods. Like what I think of is think of like the Highland or Washington Park, or say like Lakewood, right? These are mature communities. The homes have existed for several decades. In general, those feeders, those substations serving those areas have done really well. They've performed well for us. And load growth has really been more of an issue for areas like, say, Parker or Aurora or the North Metro area, where you see that the new meters being added. What's kind of different now, what I'm saying is that we're having to go look at those feeders and say like Lakewood or Wash Park, because those customers are electrifying more parts of their lives. So it's kind of changing the equation here in terms of how we have to rethink distribution grid investment. So
real quick, while you're still on this, I just want to clarify. Sure. This is the annual residential consumption per capita of only electricity, right? This ignores any other fuels that might be used. There's no like equivalent to total it. I just want to make sure I'm understanding.
Yep, nothing fancy, Commissioner Gilman. There's no propane or heating oil or gas in this. This is just purely the energy served through a PSCo electric meter. So if we're okay to move on, let's go to the next slide. So, I think that begs the question, right?
What are one question? Sorry, I can't help myself. Does the company kind of have any data or understanding in the drop that we see in per capita consumption for a residential customer? Do you have any understanding what portion of that is attributed to efficiency versus DERs like rooftop solar? Like, is there any way to understand and kind of separate those impacts?
Are you speaking to the drop between 21 and 22?
I mean, relatively drop between 16 and 23, if you just straight lined it. I mean, I know there's a bump, a little mesa in the middle, but like looking at the general trend, right, is a reduction in per capita consumption. And I was just wondering to what degree the company kind of has information about what percentage of that is efficiency versus rooftop solar or other DERs.
Yeah, we could evaluate providing like a formal breakout, if you will, and get back to you. I'd say directionally, I would expect those factors probably play into that, but I don't think that's any one factor in particular. I think the point of kind of what we've seen, right, is a lot of this is due to energy efficiency measures. I'd say the other thing to kind of point out in terms of the topology of the graphs here is one of the things that stands out to me is you really see the run up due to COVID. Starting in 2019 into 2020, plateauing, and then it kind of dropping down again, as kind of how we're operating during COVID has changed substantially over the last 18 months or so, or I guess 2 years. So that's certainly something we can follow up with you on.
Okay. And these are really just points in time, right? 2020 has 1 point, 2021 has 1 point. So it's drawn a line in between, but realistically, we didn't know about COVID exactly in 2019, right?
Exactly. And it's a fair comment, Commissioner. Just to be real clear, the trend line is just a very simple linear fit. It's not, anything overly fancy in the terms of, a polynomial fit or anything like that. It's just really meant to show the trend. So let's move on if we're okay. And, I think for me, at least, this begs the question, right? Okay, how have we managed the distribution system? If that's how we've managed the distribution system, what are the other things that PSCo has focused on? And, one of the things that we think a lot about, right, is how we just balance overall affordability for our customers and how do we act as stewards for their dollars. And one of the things we're obviously proud of, right, along with the state, is how we've invested heavily into renewables. And, our view is that this approach, right, how we've balanced distribution investments along with transmission and distribution has worked for several reasons. So the first is, like I said before, we just really, until very recently, have not had a major need to go look back at capacity challenges on existing feeders. It's not saying that we didn't look at them, but we just have not seen the load growth like we have over the last year or two on the pre-existing system. Like I said, it's all been on that frontier out in Aurora, Parker, all the growth areas. So what it's let us do is really manage just-in-time investments for the distribution system, so we can meet customer expectations when they popped up, but it allowed us to balance the overall rate impact, right, and the bill impact. In terms of what that means to generation and transmission investment, I'm kind of broadly lumping them together because really mostly this is about generation. The transmission investment lags behind the generation to some effect. But you can see from the graphic that we've put here, and this is from our sustainability report, PSCo's investment, in concert with the state's policy agenda around energy, has allowed us to go from a 4% carbon-free system to a system that's 42% carbon-free today. And then, as I know you all looked at in our ERP proceeding recently, right? We're forecasting 80% or more carbon-free energy by 2030. And so I think that's kind of the benefit that we've been able to bring to the state and to our economy overall, are these very large reductions, right? So that's kind of where the focus of investment has been over the last, I'd say, decade and a half or so. It doesn't mean that's the only focus of investment. We obviously balance between distribution, transmission, and generation, but we just want to point out that, customer sentiment has changed, the way that load growth has changed, and the way that we've invested in renewables has changed. So let's advance to the next slide, and I want to talk a little bit about how just overall, the way that the system is designed has really changed. So if you go back to the analogy I offered at the beginning of the conversation here, right? This is a 80 to 100-year-old grid. I think the average age of our system is about late 1950s. And what that means is, if you go back to the people that designed the grid well before my time, the grid was kind of a simple model, right? We had a centralized power plant. There was a handful of them throughout the state, and it was kind of a very, I almost want to say, easy flow of linear assets to go from the centralized power plant to major transmission, to city gate level transmission, to substation, to feeder, to home, right? And that model, right, the design model, that design basis was simple. We didn't have two-way power flow. There was a relatively limited use for electricity in the form of how residential customers used electricity, and that's all changed today. And that's the graphic on the right. And I think this commission and our customers are aware, but I think it's nice to see this in a graphic visual basis, because it really hits upon, for me, just how much this grid has changed. And so what I think about when you look at everything that's changed is, the first piece is the customer, starting there. Our customers are using energy in a very different way. And I'll show you all in a graphic on the next slide just what the numbers are behind that. But again, it's no longer basic lighting and a handful of appliances. It's all of that plus electric vehicles, plus electrified space heating, and much, much more. We also have distributed energy resources in our system. So there's been a large proliferation of rooftop solar. I've got some details on that in a couple slides as well, but in general, we've seen a pretty large saturation. We're certainly trending in the direction of other, Southwest states like California, Arizona, in terms of their solar penetration. We've also seen battery adoption. We've also seen large-scale build-out of renewables on our system. And I think it bears recognition, too, that even the utility-scale renewable generation, like wind and utility-scale solar, utility-scale batteries, I think you all saw this in the Colorado Electric Resource Plan, that's also very distributed as well, right? We used to have the central model where we had central plants like Comanche or Cherokee or Rocky Mountain Energy Center. And now we have, wind in the northern plains, the northeastern plains, the eastern plains, the southeastern plains, solar in the San Luis Valley, solar near Pueblo, right? So just the dynamic of the grid is kind of constantly changing. And so what that means for us from an engineering perspective, when like Dave Mino, who manages our capacity planning team, it's no longer just a simple, engineering analysis just to balance resources and load and say, okay, electrons can flow from this source to this source. We now have to contemplate two-way flow. We have to contemplate different load profiles throughout the day, right? It's no longer a single peak system. with more space heating, we're starting to see, you know, our winter peak encroach upon our summer peaks as well. So just a lot of dynamicism to how we think about how the grid works. So with that, I think let's maybe get into a little bit, a couple of numbers here. If you advance to the next slide, please. And what we want to prepare for you to think about is this inflection point that I've described of where we're at with load growth. And the graphic or the table below is just kind of a simplified view to think about how an average residential summer versus winter versus annualized energy flow works for our customers. And so the way it's kind of laid out here is the top line, the 7,050 kilowatt hours per year. That's just a total average residential house. It doesn't include other energy sources such as like gasoline for vehicles. It doesn't include natural gas. It doesn't include propane or things like that. This is just the reference electric load that we have on our system on kind of a quote unquote normal basis. And so you can see in the summer, that's about 4 months. That's about 689 kilowatt hours. You can see the winter level and you can see the annual total. This does include 4 months of shoulder. So that's kind of like a blend between summer and winter. And the point that we wanted to make with you all here today is just how much this is changing and how quickly this is changing. So if you kind of follow the top line down to the bottom part of the table, you see it's the same baseline. So, you know, we're accounting for some energy efficiency gains, right? We're obviously very proud of our energy efficiency programs and our DSM plans and things like that. So we're netting out a little bit of that on a summer, winter, and annual basis. But then you can start to see the major load growth start to pop up. So the first thing is 200 kilowatt hours in summer for an EV, same for winter, right? And that's a total of 2,400 for the year. And then if a customer buys a second EV, which I think we're starting to really see the proliferation of the secondhand market for EVs and even the tertiary market, more and more households are adopting multiple EVs, right? So you get another addition of that load. So now you're up to 4,800 kilowatt hours of EV load. So let's just call that the new baseline, right? So we've gone from about 7,000 kilowatt hours per year to 11,650 kilowatt hours per year. That's before you even start to touch the space heating part. So when you get into the space heating and the water heating piece, you can see those numbers below. So going from a gas water heater to a heat pump water heater adds load. The big thing is going from a gas furnace to a cold climate air source heat pump, which again, you saw us propose a pretty aggressive program through our clean heat plan. So we're hopeful that we'll see more customer adoption there. But that would add almost 5,600 kilowatt hours of load. And then you'll get some gained efficiencies, right? Because heat pumps do help with cooling load in the summer. So when you kind of wrap the whole thing up, right, what does this look like? If you go from a typical household today in summer, they're going to go from about 689, almost 700 kilowatt hours to 1,200. That's about 40-50% increase. In winter, you're going to go from about 600 kilowatt hours to over 2,600, almost 2,600. And then on an annual basis, going from 7,000 kilowatt hours to nearly 20,000 kilowatt hours. So kind of going back to, you know, the comparison I offered at the beginning of the conversation here, right, which was kind of this large market adoption of air conditioners in the 1960s and 1970s. This is kind of the same thing, but it's 2x the size, really. So the inflection point that we feel that we're at, right, is we've gravitated from like this distribution mindset and mentality. We mostly see energy efficiency and declining load growth to load growth is going to take the form of what I just walked you all through here in this table. And so, you know, we expect load to go up by 200 to 300%. So let's call that 250% kind of a midpoint is what we're going to have to start planning to for our customers. And that's also kind of what we're starting to see in the form of our load requests just recently in the last several months or so. So again, just want to press upon the point. This is a relatively new thing for us. This is not like we've gotten several decades of load requests at these levels. This is pretty novel, and this is what we're contemplating. What we think our average household will look like in the future as we lean into more cross-economy decarbonization through things like our transportation electrification plans, our clean heat plans, and things like that. So we'll advance if that's okay, and I'll kind of wrap up with some more thematic numbers, if you will, on just kind of what we see dynamically on the grid. So the first thing is overall, right, I like to think about this like a planning equation. I described the centralized power plant model before, and Commissioner Gilman, I think you're an engineer by background, so hopefully you'll appreciate this. But when you think about solving for power flow, there's a mathematical concept, right? Degrees of freedom, right? So I want to say it's a little bit easy. You balance the resources that are out there, you balance that with the load. And that simplified equation of the left-hand side of the equation equals the right-hand side is, we basically have to throw that equation out the window and write a new one, because we have a new precipice of load growth, but also DERs and two-way power flow. So what we wanted to kind of show here is just how much this has changed and what we're contending with as a company as we think through how do we meet the demands of our customers. And I think the first kind of data point to consider that I think and talk with my team quite a bit about is the number of conceptual capacity checks that we've seen. That was a big theme of last week's conversation with you, Commissioner. And just kind of by the numbers, I think we've gone from seeing about 50 to 80 or so per month to seeing several hundred. So it's almost a 300% increase in monthly capacity checks, which we're doing on a proactive basis for our customers, and really creates a lot of complexity when we're thinking about how to plan our grid and make infrastructure and investment decisions around feeder capacity and substation capacity. The next piece I'd point to is the large growth in EVs across our service territory. We have nearly 70,000 EVs in our service territory right now. When you look at our propensity adoption models, we're expecting to have upwards of 500,000 light-duty electric vehicles by 2030. So in the next 6 years or so, we're gonna basically 4 to 5x the number of vehicles that we have on the grid now. The other piece, and I've mentioned it several times already, right, is we've filed what we think is a pretty aggressive clean heat plan for our natural gas LDC business. And when you look at the different plans that we proposed in the clean heat plan, kind of taking a midpoint from that, we're proposing to add upwards of 200,000 heat pumps by 2030 to advance towards our clean heat targets. We're also seeing the large-scale electrification of oil and gas load in the DJ basin as well. And then on more of the two-way power flow, the DER side of things, right, we've had a very successful, obviously with the state, we've had a very successful build out of rooftop solar, and we have nearly 800 megawatts of capacity on our system right now. Each month, we're receiving around 1,300 interconnection requests every month. And from what we've seen over the last, I'll call it 18 months or so, no one's pushing the brake pedal on that. We're having to kind of reorganize internally and rethink internally, how do we process all these interconnection applications fast enough to meet our customers' needs? So I'll pause there. That's a little bit of the state on where the system has been at, the thematic issues that we've contended with over the last decade, and kind of how we're, coming out of this period of distribution investment and rethinking how we lean into our customer requests and thematic issues for the DSP. So this is kind of the break before we get into the current state of our distribution system, some of the locational things that you're questioning, Commissioner. So I'll pause if there's any specific questions on the historical piece.
Thanks. Sorry, I have a few pages of questions I noticed. So I'm trying to see if I want to hit any of them before we go down. Maybe just conceptually, as you look at that kind of typical house that you showed in the page with the table,
Sure.
I will point out that just shows energy. So clearly the timing of the occurrence of those loads and diversity of those loads will be of incredible importance. So is that something you all are also modeling and thinking about as far as, essentially the demand and when it hits being likely more important than the energy in total?
Yeah, I really love that question. It's a very astute question, so thank you for asking it. To be really clear, that table is just what I'll call it's an average it's an average flow of energy throughout a year. So it doesn't really assume that this is all differentiated peak load, right? So we're not assuming like a perfect smearing of load. To your point, if we're to see some of this incremental EV load or space heating load as coincident peak, then the need for capacity could certainly be larger than these numbers showing. So that's certainly something that we're modeling right now, is how a daily load profile will look different than a peak load profile.
Right. So with regard to like the numbers we saw, which I think was like a 40 to 50% increase in the summer and something like a 6x multiplier in the winter, maybe, those are around energy, not demand, and several other factors would influence what the demand ends up being. So can't be directly inferred from that information, right?
Yep, I agree with that assessment. That is energy, and the demand piece is still something that we're working on. I think we'll really see. I'll say it like this. I think we'll get a lot more experience with that very quickly here, as we certainly have some heat pump saturation on our system, and we're working to incorporate that into our planning process. But you're correct. We shouldn't conflate the two. It might help directionally, but I would not say that this is a proxy for capacity. In fact, I think capacity might be a bigger peak than this, but we're just starting on an energy basis.
Okay. And you had mentioned that you had said you're starting to see the winter peak encroach upon the summer peak. And I was just curious, is that really just projections we're talking about, or is the company actually seeing a lessening of the delta between the winter peak and summer peak in total?
Yeah, I'll invite Dave Mina, who's our manager of distribution system planning, to come on, and he'll be able to give you all the details on that question. Thank you.
Sorry for this specific question, but I was kind of surprised when you said that, because I was not aware you were seeing that sort of movement in terms of like beneficial electrification hitting in the winter yet.
This is why I brought the experts, Commissioner. So ask away.
Mute yours first.
Appreciate your
Hey,
coordination.
Commissioner Gilman, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, appreciate you not screeching our eardrums. So thanks.
Sorry. Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah, so to elaborate on that, some of the distribution system is already a winter peaking system, right? Primarily in the mountains, the Front Range areas. We have pockets of areas where we already have a winter peak over a summer peak. I think we are starting to see some encroachment in some locations, especially where there's higher adoption of these technologies. I wouldn't say it's holistically it's everywhere, or every single asset within a certain geographical area, but we are starting to see certain feeders, certain transformers that are seeing an increase in demand from a winter standpoint that was traditionally a summer peaking system.
Is that, I'm curious though, is the delta decreasing, or is the summer peak also increasing in those places where the winter peak is increasing? Are we actually shrinking the delta between winter and summer, and how kind of prevalent is that?
Yeah, I don't have all the data on that, but I mean, from the information I have seen, certain areas, we are still seeing a summer peak increase. Probably not as quickly as we are seeing winter peaking increasing. But that delta in some areas is becoming smaller and more narrow, to where we have less of a margin to absorb some of that winter demand compared to summer peak. But again, it's really the locational specific and adoption specific locations, I would say.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Mr. Martz, maybe if we can, let's get into like the specific circumstances on the system that you can outline for me, and then I'll probably get to the bulk of my questions after we get through that.
That's good. Well, it's a good transition point. I'm up next. So yeah, we wanted to spend some time to go through the current state of the distribution system and provide some insights into where we're actually seeing some of these constraints. If you can advance to the next slide, please. So this is a summary. We have some subsequent slides after this one to show some more specific locational information, but this is more of a highlight of some of the constraints that we're seeing. So approximately 20% of the substation transformers are currently overloaded today. And then by 2027, we're expecting that to increase to about 28%. Now, this doesn't account for any of the projects that we currently have planned within the 5-year budget. So, that might be somewhat inflated from that perspective. But in addition, the growth in that forecast is not also accounting for the electrification that we're anticipating to hit the system, as well as other technologies such as electric vehicles and other DER technologies. The majority of these bank overloads are within the Denver metro area, although these bank overloads are really scattered throughout the entire distribution system, as we'll kind of get into in a little bit. Some of the challenges that we're encountering right now that are somewhat exacerbating this and our ability to implement some of these projects to offload these overloads is we're facing a significant amount of constraints around land acquisition and permitting for our infrastructure. From a feeder perspective, getting right of way, getting permits and easements to route our conductors, especially as we incorporate more underground conductors as opposed to overhead, as has historically been the case. But also when we're looking at new substations, acquiring new land, especially in these areas that Steve mentioned are really fully built out and mature load centers, is becoming even more challenging, especially as these areas are increasing their electrification demand. Another challenge that we're running into from a DER perspective is front of the meter generation. So DERs that are not paired with load, which do have the ability to offload and provide some capacity relief to the system. They're interconnecting in rural areas where we typically don't have these constraints. In fact, they're actually creating other infrastructure challenges. There's a stat here that says around almost 60% of the interconnected CSG capacity is at 7 substations on our distribution system. And those are all in rural areas where they're not large load centers per se. So, all these factors are really kind of driving some of the challenges that we're facing as we're looking to implement our 5-year budget and the projects we have to offload a lot of these assets that are overloaded. If you want to this slide, please.
Mr. Minoka, I just clarify a couple things on this side before we move
course.
on. You had said that the 20% of the substation banks currently overloaded and then up to 28% by 2027 exclude any projects that will be dealt with in your 5-year capital budget.
Correct. So the 20%
anything that's overloaded and will be fixed according to your capital budget, we're not seeing in these numbers. It doesn't exist as far as what we're seeing here.
That's correct. Yeah, that 28% by 2027, that's assuming none of the projects within the 5 years are implemented. So we do have our mitigations within our 5-year budget that will address these, but the numbers here, the 20% is current today, and that 2027 number does not reflect any of the projects that we've identified and are working to implement to offload that 20%. But
Okay.
that 28% is meant to show if nothing is done today from our budget standpoint, if some of these projects don't get implemented, and then the growth is that we've identified, again, not including the electrification demand, but just our normal growth that we're seeing, we would hit that 28%.
Sorry, I understood it to be the opposite, so I'm really glad I clarified. Okay, so basically these substations, the 20% that you understand to be overloaded now, and then the projected 28% by 2027, you do have mitigations in your 5-year capital budget or whatever I should be calling it that fully addresses some, like what impact these numbers.
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah, I would say the majority of them are resolved within that 5-year budget. Some of these longer range mitigations, like new substations, may be outside of that window, but yeah, I don't have that specific number in front of me right now. But yeah, the 5-year budget is largely meant to relieve that 20% that we're currently overloaded today.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. I would have been on the wrong direction on this, so I'm glad I interrupted you and asked. Sorry. One other question with regard to the second sentence there in the first bullet. So it sounds like these projections for substation bank overloading does not consider increased electrification in DERs. I guess I'm a bit curious why not, and if you have some alternative forecasts that do consider increased electrification DERs, especially considering there's legislation that requires movement in that direction in many respects. B, that you all actually have plans in front of us that indicate movement in that direction, and C, that the DSP rules insist that you do your forecasting based on some of these state policy objectives. So just curious, is there another version that has different numbers, and where could we find that?
Yeah, we'll have that information in our next DSP filing to present how we're doing that. So this is legacy, how we've planned the system, right? It's been the known growth in the short term. This is what we highlighted in our last DSP filing, right? That's gotten us to this point. Our forecasts have historically been the known growth in the short term and then a growth projection for the outer years to round out what we're anticipating from a demands perspective and a growth perspective. And actually this year, and we'll have some of this information later on, but I could touch on it now. We are incorporating electrification, EVs, behind the meter solar into our forecast. We plan the system to, and that we're going to present in this upcoming DSP. And that information, we are going to be developing our 5-year capital budget around. So it's part of our evolving distribution planning process. I would say we're working towards that, and knowing that, yes, DSP does require that, and we are performing those scenario forecasts. But historically, we didn't plan the system to those from that perspective. We planned the system to what we considered our base forecast, which is the known growth. So that way, we invested in the right locations given where we were anticipating these loads to increase. But knowing that where we are today, when we know that we need to account for those other technology types to hit the distribution system, it is something that we are incorporating in what we consider our base forecast. So that way we can plan the system around those technology types.
Okay, and just one more, and then I'll let you go
Yeah.
on. Sorry. In kind of these base forecasts, or even these numbers we're looking at right here, as far as the 20% and 28%, do those at all take into account, I think what Mr. Martz characterized as a pretty significant uptake in new load trying to connect, or new DERs trying to interconnect? He really points to this pretty dramatic increase recently. And I'm just wondering if these numbers we're looking at with the 20%, 28% take that into account, or if that's part of what you're doing for the next DSP that's not quite done.
Yeah, so I would say this does reflect that uptick in capacity requests that we've received on the system. Like I was saying, like our base forecast is centered around the known growth that we're anticipating to come onto the system. So the uptick in the capacity checks and the requests that we've been receiving for capacity on the distribution system are reflected in those numbers from a load perspective, I would say.
Okay, thanks. Go on.
Of course. Okay, you want to go to the next slide? So this next slide is meant to really show kind of more geographically how these risks are spread out throughout the distribution system. So on the left here, we have our 13 planning divisions that are broken out, their geographic locations, and then also we're also showing the total number of feeders within each of those planning divisions. And then the 3 columns on the right are showing different tiers of utilization rates for each of those assets. So you kind of see that 75% number there. That's a pretty critical number for us from a distribution planning perspective. We're going to definitely highlight that more in our DSP coming up here in November. But the 75% is really critical to our overall integrated distribution design, as well as our contingency planning. So for the numbers that we showed on the previous slide, especially from the bank perspective, here we're considering anything over that 75% as something that is overloaded. So as you can see here, the feeder overloads, especially over that 100% rating, are really spread throughout all the distribution system. It's not necessarily located or isolated just to the metro area here. The only exception is that Front Range division, pretty much everywhere from west of Golden to the Eisenhower Tunnel. That's the area that has the most capacity, I would say. But as you see, the overloads that we're seeing on the distribution feeders are really pretty widespread throughout the distribution system here. And then if you factor in that 75% margin as well, that number really increases to over half of our feeders are what we consider overloaded from that perspective. So this information was shared in the DSP in terms of what the forecast was showing, what the ratings of the feeders were. However, that was an older vintage of data, and it wasn't necessarily broken down into this structure here. But this is really meant to show where, from a high level, where we're seeing these challenges from a capacity standpoint. So like in the metro area, we're facing a lot of rampant growth, which is exacerbated by our challenges that I was mentioning on the previous slide for our ability to build out new capacity. So whether that's getting right of way or permitting for our underground conductors, or acquiring land in these dense load centers to build out new substation capacity. And then in the rural areas, we tend to have smaller legacy equipment, such as conductors and transformers, that sometimes hits that capacity rating a little quicker than it would in the metro area. If you want to advance to the next slide.
Can I ask you a couple questions?
Sure,
Sorry.
yeah.
So this says forecast year 2023, but are these actual actuals for all intents and purposes since 2023 is done? You know, this is not really a forecast. We know this to be the case.
Yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
And then with regard to the utilization rates, you had pointed to the 75%, which is listed as utilization rate. Can you just characterize from a technical perspective what that means in terms of, you know, peak load versus minimum load or average daily load or however that means? Can you help me understand in a technical sense what that's telling us?
Yeah, so the 75% is a pretty critical number for us. So when you look at our substation transformer ratings and how many different feeders are supplied by those transformers, the ratings to make sure that we can utilize the full capacity of all those assets within the system design is really centered around that 75%. For example, on a 13 kV feeder, the 75% rating is around 10.2 MVA. We have 5 feeders out of a distribution substation transformer for 50 MVA. So the 5 feeders at 10.2 is roughly that 50 MVA for that transformer. So that's what I meant from like an aligning of the overall system design. And then also from a contingency standpoint, that 25% is what we bank on for if we were to lose its transformer or a feeder. We have additional capacity on those assets to pick up load for the duration of that outage to ride through that outage and restore power to the customers that are impacted until the repairs are made. So I think there's more to your question. Can you repeat that? Sorry.
No, it's helpful. I'm just trying to figure out like what exactly this number tells us in terms of actual circumstance. So if you're kind of characterizing it as if we have essentially enough feeders and therefore a load that could be served by those feeders already taking up the substation, then the substation would be under this stress or above the 75%, if I'm characterizing it right. Does it take into account like actuals, like the actual capacity being experienced? Is it just the potential of the feeders, or is it the actual capacity being experienced on the feeders in terms of the percent loading you're seeing in actuality on these feeders or these substations?
Can you clarify your question? I'm sorry, I don't know if I fully captured all that.
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand if the 75% is based on kind of the rated potential of the feeders and the loads. Obviously, the loads have dictated kind of the sizing probably of the feeders running to them. Or is it an actual experienced capacity peak that plans for what percent we're at? Is it the actual capacity y'all are experiencing in these areas, or it's the rated capacity of kind of the equipment that you're serving that's a theoretical maximum more than an actual maximum in terms of loading?
Yeah, so I think when you look at like the equipment ratings, that 100% continuous is based on that equipment rating, and then that 75% of that is really more so around how we plan the system in terms of the items I mentioned. So how we align that with our overall substation design, how we account for our contingencies to make sure that we can adequately, maintain reliability of the system. So the 100% is really based on the continuous rating of our equipment, and then the planning rating of that 75% is a fraction of that continuous rating of the equipment. So that way, in a contingency, you can bump up the loading, you can transfer load around and get up to the 100%. You can ride out that outage for the duration of the the equipment damage until it's repaired, and then you can restore power.
Okay. And then just help me kind of square a little bit with what I'm seeing here with the previous slide. I know this is showing feeders and the other one's the substation bank.
Yep, the next slide has banks on it. Yep.
Okay, I'm just trying to square the numbers because here I've got kind of 29% and then another 20-something% was in the red. But on the previous slide, it was only 20% of the substation banks are in problem. Okay, so this
Yep.
one lines up more.
So this one, yeah, you can see it's about 21%-ish, something like that. So this is showing based on our 2023 values where our substation transformers are. So same format, just looking at different asset types. So you can see here, when you look at 100% of those bank ratings, the majority of those are actually in rural areas where we typically have smaller transformers in our substations. But when you look at that 75% rating of the bank as well, you start to see that these these risks are starting to pop up scattered throughout the distribution system. So that's where this is where we're getting that 20% from, approximately.
Okay, thank you. Sorry,
Mhm.
I'm trying to get my terms right.
Sure.
Okay, so it seems like significantly, a fairly significant, if we can go to the previous slide, a fairly significant percentage of feeders are at or above this 75% level that you find concerning. Can we go to the previous slide, slide 12? There you go, thank you. So we're seeing much higher percentages here in terms of feeders versus the next slide. And we had that discussion on the substation banks in terms of like what's included in your 5-year capital plan already. So being that we're seeing much higher percentages of feeders, are these problematic feeders, basically what looks to be 52% of feeders in a potentially problematic situation, are these also included in your 5-year capital plan or not? And kind of how's that determined?
Yes. So our 5-year capital budget, it focuses on relieving all the distribution risks that we've encountered, essentially. So feeders and transformers. So we try to stack as many of these risks together when we're putting a project together to resolve as many risks and get the biggest bang for our buck, essentially. But yes, so this is the same philosophy here. Our 5-year capital budget is largely looking to address these risks, as well for both feeders and transformers.
Okay, thank you for clearing that up for me. Sorry.
Of course. So can you advance to the next slide, please? So now that we've any additional questions on the kind of the locational specifics or any of the current constraints on the distribution system? If not, we can kind of talk through how we're looking to address this.
Yeah, I mean, those gave fairly kind of broad areas. I guess one concern I'd like to better understand, I was kind of hoping some mapping or something might make it a little more clear. To what extent are the areas you're seeing the most prevalent distribution system problems or issues located in DI communities or other areas with kind of equity concerns? Just I'd be interested in any information as sort of what is the overlap from an equity perspective on where we're seeing shortfalls in ability to serve new load in those sorts of communities. I don't know if you have any information on that.
I don't have specifics around how this overlaps with the DI communities. Be happy to maybe talk more about what specific constraints we're kind of seeing in certain areas or any kind of way you want to piece that apart, but I don't have any specifics around how this overlaps with DI communities in front of me.
Okay. And I'm looking at the map that you all sent over just before this, the confidential map, which I understand you don't want to bring up. And it's pretty broad, I would say. It's pretty zoomed out. Is it possible to get something from you all in this proceeding that is more zoomed in, and that we could also look at the overlap with DI communities, following this workshop?
I'd have to get back to you on how we would overlap with DI communities. I think we could probably do something like that, and we can absolutely do a more zoomed in view, maybe by planning division, if that maybe gives it a little more of a granular look and looking at how these substations are loaded on a more zoomed in view. If that's helpful.
Okay. And then maybe some other in these areas that have the overloaded substations or feeder issues, are these areas that have, in a broader sense, experienced kind of faster growth than other areas? Or have you all been able to pinpoint why these specific areas became overloaded kind of more in advance of other areas and correlate that to anything else in particular?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's largely due to we're seeing more rapid growth and larger loads coming on the system, which chew up larger percentages of the available capacity than we have seen historically. So I think it's a combination of larger loads, quicker acceleration of growth, that is really driving that perspective.
And I heard Mr. Martz say, we have had a significant increase in these very large loads. Like he said, 50 megawatts plus loads looking to connect all of a sudden, which I understand could be a pretty big deal.
Mm-hmm.
are those certain types of loads? Like, are those all data centers? Are those all certain types of things? Not your everyday customer trying to connect 50 megawatts. I'm not asking for names or locations. I just like, is there a new type of load that is kind of exacerbating or causing pressure that comes quickly and is of this massive size?
Yeah, I think data centers are definitely a portion of that. They're dense loads with high load factors, requiring significant amount of capacity on the distribution system. In some of our more rural areas, I think the electrification of oil and gas is really driving up demand in some of those areas where they're not quite necessarily, large load centers from like a residential perspective, but we're seeing pretty large demands being electrified from oil and gas drilling. So I think those two are probably the largest demands that we're seeing, but we're also just seeing denser demands in general across the board.
Okay. How mature do you like perceive the electrification of oil and gas to be in terms of kind of penetration point we're at?
As it stands today, I think it's still a little early. We've received a significant amount of applications over the next few years to electrify those demands, and that's baked into our forecast that we're planning to. But I think they're early on in terms of actually implementing the electrification. They do have plans, and they've been sharing, a lot of those customers have been sharing them with us, and we're accounting for that in our growth. And that's a lot of the rural areas where we're seeing the overloads is partially driven by that. And then the mitigations we have in place to resolve that are also to, offload those ultimately. But I think there's definitely a lot more demand that's going to be hitting the system from that customer class.
Okay. And with regard to the other kind of upticks you've seen in maybe size, I think as Mr. Martz described it, you are already seeing kind of an impact of electrification of other loads like vehicles or heating. Are you all able to, or are you making any attempt to kind of track the locational occurrence of where you're seeing these big upticks to try to understand, are there certain building codes or policies or things tied to more adoption or quicker adoption in certain areas of the system?
Yes, we do. We track them. We have to for our forecast. So we are tracking these, and we are keeping an eye on where these loads are materializing, especially these larger loads. Individual customers who are electrifying or adding electric vehicles, we don't necessarily have the insights to unless it's a greenfield like new build, but we are tracking them from that perspective. And we work with our account managers and regional account reps to identify the locations and municipalities that have these codes and building codes that are going to be driving these different types of demand adoptions. But so that helps us, and we'll get into it in a little bit here with our solutions in terms of how we're building out propensity models as we're looking at adoption of these different technologies. So there's kind of a couple facets to that. Okay.
And then one more minute maybe on the historical before we go into what you'll do next, which I very much appreciate. My understanding, at least from kind of company witnesses and representatives, has been that the company does not perceive they have seen much, if any, residential electrification of heating yet. Is that different than what you're saying today? Or you all, I was a little confused. It sounded like maybe a lot of the uptick in kind of need or tightness on the system was pointing to electrification. It just wasn't my understanding that the company was indicating they had seen a lot of that hit the system yet. So perhaps if you could help me understand to what degree you all have already seen impacts of electrification and to what extent you can identify vehicular versus kind of building electrification and to what extent it's forecast. Mr. Pollock.
Let's see if I get it.
Well, let me mute real quick.
Let's try that again. Can you hear me okay, Commissioner Gilman? Good afternoon. Yeah, so I think Mr. Mino alluded to it slightly, but he brought up a really good point in that programmatically, we see the electrification that we're putting into market. So today, my understanding, that's about 2,000 heat pumps. With EVs, certainly somebody can put in a level 2 charger, and we may not be aware of that. So as far as what we've seen programmatically that's been rebated or incentivized through our programs, we're seeing a pretty small uptick One of the things we're absolutely looking into is the data and analytic capabilities to better understand adoption of measures that we may not be directly involved in those transactions. So we're looking at things like load disaggregation using our AMI data, looking at other ways of understanding what loads might be occurring behind the customer meter. But really just wanted to emphasize that's one of the challenges that Mr. Martz alluded to. Historically, everything we've seen come onto our system through the builder's call line. So we have awareness and visibility of those load requests. So it's a little bit difficult to track right now, just everything that's happening, whether it be policy driven or individual customer choice and adoption driven. But we're certainly making progress on trying to understand the things which we may not be directly involved in that will ultimately impact our forecast.
Thanks, Mr. Pollock. Yeah, that was kind of one of my other questions I had written down in terms of like how well the company understands the business as usual growth to be expected. First of all, with population. Second of all, with, I would say, kind of ambient electrification that may not be a result of clean heat. It may not even be a result of your BE plan, just, what is going to happen in the market regardless. And then what are the specific impacts of any of these programs? And then what does this look like with like a meaningful demand flexibility, demand response program that could help mitigate kind of the worst outcomes of pancaking peaks?
Absolutely. And I did want to iterate or reiterate one of the points that was alluded to earlier, talking about some of the evolution in our load forecasting capabilities. So I think as you probably recall from the previous DSP settlement, we have implemented a software tool called LoadSeer. And in order to disaggregate both on a demand impact level and an individual resource level, as well as spatially where on the grid we may see those impacts, we're basically taking, for the resources Mr. Martz had in his earlier table, really an 8760 load shape of those and laying that onto our traditional base forecast that's largely based and informed by history to be able to come up with a more granular impact of those DERs, not just for things that are already on the system, but more critically looking forward, using basically a propensity adoption model to understand for some of those DER types, how we expect that to impact the distribution system and capacity needs moving forward. So just wanted to put a little bit of a finer point on that.
No, that's helpful. And are you able to model in that not just kind of a straight hour by hour model of what it would use if left to its own devices, but also what would it be like if we were really trying to get demand flexibility in those units, if we had virtual power plants able to influence the usage of those, like how much flexibility is there? Is that modeling able to account for that sort of flexibility to kind of lessen the impact on the system?
Yeah, my understanding, subject to being corrected by Mr. Minor here, since it's his team and he's really the experts, but you have the ability to see really the valley and the troughs, both on an individual DER basis on those load shapes, as well as what it looks like from a net perspective on a given piece of equipment, whether that be a feeder or a substation transformer. So effectively, to answer your question, yes, you can use the load shapes, whether they be an aggregate load shape or an individual DER shape, to understand what the potential might be for load flexibility programs.
Mr. Mino, did you have to correct him, or are we good?
No, I think I agree with what Zach said. We're still evolving our abilities within the LoadSeer tool, given that we've only been using it for a few years now. But we do have that ability to look at load shapes for different technologies or different scenarios and look at the net impacts of how those impact the distribution system. And I think we're evolving our practice of how we implement that analysis.
Okay. And so do you anticipate kind of as you're running this in preparation for the next DSP? I'm sure you're going to tell us a lot, so sorry if I'm jumping ahead, but I'm very interested. Are you going to try to also be modeling some demand flexibility, kind of virtual power plant type interaction to see what does it look like if we try to smooth out the valleys and troughs in a more efficient use of?
Yeah, happy to take that one. I think we're in the early stages of that conversation, but I can give you an anecdote of something that speaks to that. So we had a meeting, we're meeting basically every week now on developing our next DSP. We had an issue where we're running our forecast over long term, and we realized that if we took the shape of our managed charging program today and ran that out through the mid 2030s, that was actually creating a new peak on the system at 12 midnight. So clearly we have an issue with that, that we're trying to identify opportunities both at the system level as well as the individual feeder level to mitigate exactly those types of situations. So absolutely the intent, we're not quite there yet, but it's definitely part of the conversation.
Okay, thanks. And does load seer only model or account for kind of forecasting on the electric system, or does that get into the gas system at all as well?
Yeah, so we just have the electric distribution system model within load seer. Where in areas like for like the GIP filing, the gas alternative investment program, where we anticipate some electrification of those gas demands, we incorporate that into our electric forecast. But the load seer tool is strictly the electric distribution system modeling tool, at least
Okay,
today.
so it doesn't have like a gas component y'all can utilize. It's just
No, that does not.
so helps me understand. Okay, perfect. I'll let you continue. Sorry for the interruption.
Okay. Okay, so this slide here is really to show what the historic distribution planning process has looked like, and then also including areas in terms of how it's evolving. So I'll go through the legacy planning process, and then I'll kind of touch on how we're changing that currently. So historically, our distribution planning process is an annual process where we have historically identified the peak loading on each distribution feeder, each distribution transformer, quantified what kind of risk that loading material is going to present on the distribution system, both in year zero as well as throughout the forecast. So we have two types of risks that we identify on the distribution system: N-0, which is overloads like we've been discussing; N-1s, which is contingency risks, which is where that 75% margin really comes into play. So if we were to lose a transformer or we were to lose a feeder, the customer is served by those assets would then be rerouted through the distribution system until the repairs are made. So we quantify those risks in terms of how many hours throughout the year that risk is present, how severe of an overload or contingency risk we have. So what kind of megawatts we're looking at, how many consecutive hours, that's really critical when we consider things like non-wires alternatives. So we quantify these risks, and then we develop projects to mitigate them, right? And that's what feeds into our 5-year capital budget. So we come up with what we think is an appropriate risk or mitigation. We come up with different scenarios and alternatives, different types of projects that might resolve those risks. And then we do a cost benefit analysis to look at which one do we think is the most effective at resolving as many risks as possible, as effectively and cost efficiently as possible. After that process, we kind of hone in on what those specific projects we're going to pursue are. And then we use that to round out what our 5-year budget is going to look like. Then we kind of work through the project details with the various internal teams that are associated and kind of stakeholders in that process. And ultimately, then those projects are designed and implemented. So where this process is evolving is, rather than just looking at a single data point in terms of what a peak looks like, as Zach alluded to, we're now developing in what we call an 8760 curve. So pretty much a data point for every hour throughout the entire year, 8760 hours in a year. So not only we have our base 8760 curve, and then we also forecast out for 10 years what that 8760 curve will look like for each asset. Then when we're adding new demands to the system, we have load curves for the different technologies that are associated with those technology types. And we layer those onto that temporal curve, like time curve, to look at what the impacts are going to be. Because historically, we had a peak value. Any demand that was coming on, we consider that being layered on top of the peak. But as we know, a lot of these technologies aren't necessarily summer peaking, right? So a lot of electrification demands going to hit in the winter. So it's not quite an apples to apples comparison to look at just peak to peak comparisons, right? So this 8760 curve is really critical to really see the impacts of those different technology types. So like I alluded to before, what we've historically planned the system to, what we call our base forecast, was just known load growth that we've received applications for, and then our corporate growth forecast that we layered on to the outer years where we didn't quite have a clear picture of what demands were going to hit the system, since typically we only really know of those demands in the early years, first year to 3 years typically. So now what we're evolving our base forecast to is to include electrification demand, so a forecast scenario from our clean heat filing that we filed recently. We also are including electric vehicle demands and their associated load curves to that base, hourly curve that we have. And then the way that load seer works is you take a high level forecast and you allocate it down to each individual premise, right? But what we're working on is building out the propensity for each of these different premises for adoption of these different technology types. So that way, when you allocate it, it's just allocating it with some sophistication and math behind it, not just a peanut butter spread of these technologies. So in areas, for example, where there's green building codes that are looking to electrify, we can increase the propensity of adoption for electrification in those locations. So that when we allocate that high level forecast, there's more of a likelihood that it gets distributed to those locations where those technologies are more likely to be adopted. So our base forecast that we're working on currently, that we're finalizing, within this next few weeks, includes electrification, it includes electric vehicles, and includes behind the meter solar. So the load modifying impacts of behind the meter solar as well. So that way we can round out what we anticipate the growth from all these technologies combined are going to be on the system, and then build out our mitigations and do our risk analysis and our mitigation development based on those projections, not just the known growth. So that way we're trying to get more ahead of these technology adoptions, essentially. For our risk analysis, we've just done our risk analysis on that base model, that base forecast, which again, just includes the known growth. Here, we anticipate performing this risk analysis for all the different scenarios that we're performing to identify if we hit that scenario that we have in DSP that's aligning with the state's greenhouse gas reduction roadmap. How does that increase the risk profile of the distribution system compared to just the known growth that we were historically planning to? And then the high adoption rate as well. So we plan on performing the risk analysis for all these different scenarios to really get a handle of what we anticipate the system risk profile to look like under each scenario. So then from a mitigation and project development, we are looking at non-wild alternatives as some of our projects that we're trying to implement, as well as looking at some other secondary benefits, right? So if there's projects for different programs within the company, such as transportation electrification plan projects that have been identified or wildfire projects that have been identified, really looking at that holistically in terms of where we're seeing our risks on our system from a capacity standpoint and trying to build synergies between those programs so we're not, duplicating efforts or wasting, money and resources towards multiple projects towards the same area, but really trying to align them as much as possible. So really trying to value stack that from our perspective. From a budget standpoint, we still just had the 5-year capital budget, but we're trying to do a more long-range substation planning process to where knowing that substations are typically take longer than 5 years to implement, right? So not having them on our radar is going to, just further fuel our capacity challenges. So really trying to get out ahead of where do we think we're in these substations to support the growth that we're seeing on the system, especially in these areas that are really densely populated and fully built out, like these mature communities that are really, there's not a lot of land available to build new substations. So really trying to figure out where we think we can acquire land, where we think substations could realistically go. So that way we can develop those projects and initiate them, even though they may not be within the 5-year budget. So so we're really looking to evolve this process here. And we are already underway with that, but this is just some insights in terms of how more long-term we anticipate us getting more of a handle of the capacity of the distribution system and getting ahead of a lot of these technologies. So I'll throw a lot out there, so I'll pause there before moving forward.
Yeah, maybe just a question on the base forecast. So if I'm correct, your base forecast for the planning for your distribution system would be the state policy goals kind of benchmark, both in terms of, probably the most relevant in terms of EVs and beneficial electrification uptake. The beneficial electrification uptake is a little amorphous, and then it might be an offshoot of your clean heat plan and BE plans specifically. But essentially, if I'm understanding, your base forecast would intend to be able to support the state policy goals for those electrification that's expected?
Not necessarily, I would say. We're trying to work towards that. And that's part of the risk analysis that I was talking about under the scenarios. We want to see how the state policy and the high adoption rate beyond the state policy goals would impact the distribution system. But this is kind of our first step in evolving that process. So we're planning on using one of the scenario forecasts from the Clean Heat Plan as our electrification forecast that we layer into our base forecast, as well as one of the EV forecasts that we have showing different adoption rates for the EVs as our base forecast. It's not necessarily in alignment with the state policy goals, but it's a step in that direction. And it looks like maybe Zach has some follow-ups on that one.
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner. Sorry, I get a little bit of feedback. Can you hear me okay, Commissioner Gilman? Second time's the charm. Yeah, just to follow up on Mr. Mano's point here. So I think there's two different questions potentially, if I'm understanding the question correctly. There's the DSP rule requirements, which required to present that forecast. I think the actual forecast that we plan our system to may be a separate question. And quite frankly, where we are with the analytics right now, we don't know the impact of that from a cost and infrastructure perspective. So that's something we're diligently looking to understand. But I will say it's certainly a concern from a customer affordability perspective of some of the numbers we've seen coming out of other states like California and New York as far as the rate impacts. So, we have the obligation to present those facts to you. But as far as what we actually plan our system to right now, I think that's still an open question.
Okay. So yeah, you're right. In the DSP rules, essentially around the question of forecasting, kind of the base level is to hit the state policy goals. And then there is a higher growth scenario that should be modeled. So I was somewhat under the assumption that whatever that would be submitted in the DSP proceeding, either that already happened or that is coming to hit those state policy goals, would also be what the company is internally using to plan the system. But there is a whole separate forecast that you all plan to use the system that is somewhat unhinged from the state policy goals. Is that what I'm hearing?
I would delineate it a little bit differently. So historically, I think that's an accurate characterization. What Mr. Meyer has been describing is that we've been rolling in the assumptions into our base forecast, specifically around EVs and clean heat, that do align with the state policy scenario. That's obviously a bit of a, eye of the beholder question, given that clean heat has both a cost target and an emissions target. So, you could argue that the state policy goal may fall somewhere in between there. Our other, again, just consideration is understanding the impacts of that from a cost and infrastructure perspective, which today we don't have the analytics on, but are quickly making progress on doing that so we can make the best informed decision in future cost recovery and DSP proceedings.
Okay. So to the extent, and I'm sorry if I'm mischaracterizing it, correct me, but to the extent that in the DSP, we see different scenarios forecasted than is what the company is actually planning for in your capital budgets, how do we understand your actual plans?
Do you mind rephrasing that?
So if the state policy goal is the benchmark, that's like the minimum to plan for in the DSP rules, and then a higher adoption scenario. To the extent that the company has another forecast that you all use when you set your actual 5-year capital budget and whatnot, how would the commission understand the actual distribution system planning going on in the company, which I kind of think is the purpose of the DSP, if there's actually a different forecast that's used?
Yeah, I think we have the ability to lay that out transparently. Again, notwithstanding the first DSP, but moving forward, putting the cards on the table as far as the scenario forecasts that are required by the DSP rules, as well as the actual forecasts that we're recommending going forward on. I think it's really difficult for the company to be in the position today to say that we are absolutely going to plan to something that exceeds the state policy forecasts or the state policy goals in its entirety without understanding what the cost impacts of that look like.
Okay. So that, but you agree with me, like it's not necessarily, I guess, oversight of the rules. I kind of presumed whatever forecasts were provided here was actually being used in the distribution system planning. So I guess we'd be looking for, in that case, in the distribution system planning, to see what the company is actually using. And so
That's
I
correct.
get what you're saying there. This could represent some proactive investment that could look quite expensive that may not come to fruition. I guess the flip side of that coin is if the company is not planning their system size and components in order to meet the state policy goals, that we would necessarily be behind from a time perspective on meeting those if the company is not planning to meet them kind of in the time that they're expected to occur.
Yeah, and apologies. I think we're talking past each other a little bit here, but absolutely, that wasn't a consideration in the first DSP because our forecasting capabilities and sophistication weren't at that point yet. But in the next DSP, we absolutely intend to indicate which forecasts we've modeled, how they comply with state policy, and the forecast that would include going above and beyond state policy, as well as what we're actually recommending to plan our system to. That really just wasn't a conversation in the first DSP, but that is absolutely in play for our next DSP, and really one of the main focal points given how critical forecasting is to DSP and any requisite investments that may come to enable it.
Okay, and then I don't have the timeline for clean heat in front of me, but I know we're going to hearing in March, so I don't know, that's May something conclusion. Given that you all won't file your DSP until November, are you all going to be able, and are you planning to incorporate the results of the clean heat proceeding into your load forecasting in time to kind of have it be part of the DSP?
That's a great question. Where we landed internally on that is we're incorporating, I believe, what's the amount of electrification proposed in the amended preferred plan. Obviously, it's a little bit of a guess as far as what the final decision may be on that plan. But we feel like given that that's the middle ground between the cost target and the emissions target, it's a reasonable starting point. And also because we do file DSPs biannually, we have the opportunity to do some course correction depending on what the final decision may be in that case, as well as what we may see in market as far as actions resulting from clean heat programs.
From a timing perspective, it seems to me we have maybe a 4 or 5 month buffer. Is it really infeasible to consider the outcome of that proceeding?
I'll say it's extremely challenging, just given that the forecasting is the foundation of several other internal processes, including developing the capital budget, approving the capital budget, beginning the mitigation identification process. So it does create some pretty significant internal challenges.
Okay, just trying to understand, help me better understand what's being planned. Okay, I think I can stop interrupting you now and let you keep going with your presentation.
Sure. Yeah, just maybe one more note on that topic before we move on too is, as we build out our 5-year budget, we don't want to lose sight of where the actual real risks are being materialized, right? So these actual requests that we're kind of talking about here today, we don't want to lose sight that we need to resolve those as well in the short term, and rather than maybe build out infrastructure somewhere where that load is maybe not as immediate. So there's just a balancing act there. That's a part of the planning process. Just want to add a little note here, but then if you can advance the slide, please. So here's some more additional solutions in terms of what we're already working on, what we kind of see as our short-term fix, and then what we're thinking long-term. So as we kind of already alluded to, our enhanced forecasting process here, where we anticipate or we're planning to incorporate, electrification, electric vehicles, behind-the-meter solar in we're considering our base forecast that we plan the system to and budget around. We're already doing some low-cost efforts to create capacity on the system. So whether we can switch load from feeder A to feeder B, if there's capacity on feeder B and there's constraints on feeder A, that's a quick thing that we can implement pretty quickly, and relatively cost effectively as well. If we identify that there's imbalances between the 3 different power phases, that high phase is driving that peak, we're already looking to balance those out to create some additional marginal capacity on those feeders and transformers. Project phasing and timing, right? So as we get customer load requests and especially for these more sizable demands, we're really trying to work with the customers to identify what their ramp rate looks like, so we can identify how much demand they anticipate bringing on each year, rather than assuming that it's all going to come on day one, which is historically not the case. So we're trying to really get more granular with, when we anticipate this demand and how much we anticipate hitting the system from a timing perspective. Some other relatively cheap projects that we can implement, although the timing is due to supply chains is increasing, is implementing just VAR planning in general. So looking at providing capacitor banks and improve the power factor and reduce the overall current flow through the system in areas where we have a pretty poor power factor. So trying to improve that so we can improve the power flow in the system and make sure that it's operating as efficiently as possible. Load diversification. So kind of similar to that project phasing, we're really trying to identify what we really anticipate that demand to be, right? A lot of the times when customers apply, they provide National Electric Code demands, calculations for what the building is designed around, but it's not the same thing as what the peak demand for that building is going to be, right? Those are two completely different things. So, we use our internal expertise, given we've been doing this for a long time, to really diversify those demands that we receive from customers. So we don't have to be as conservative as we would be if we weren't getting the full picture from the customer. So we're really trying to diversify that load down back into what we anticipate that load hitting the system is going to be. And then as we add that into our low SEER tool and apply load curves, we get to see what that demand is going to be like over a specific time period, throughout the entire year for every hour, not just what we think that's going to contribute to peak, right? Because peaks are going to shift depending on the technologies that are adopted and, the rates that are, applicable to those technologies, like time of use. Excuse me. And then we're also looking to provide more information to customers through our host capacity efforts. So we had that for generation. We had those heat maps, and we'll get into like some of the progress that we're making on that through the DSP settlement and rules. But we're also providing tabular data for what the load hosting capacity is going to be. So that way customers can, especially, I'll take a step back. So as we implement that secure portal to where we are anticipating producing the non-heat map version of our host capacity maps, we anticipate adding tabular results for the load capacity so that customers can see what the minimum and maximum capacity for a given feeder is, what those specific constraints are. So they're better informed in terms of what they anticipate, how their specific projects may be impacted by the overall capacity of the system. So that's kind of where we are today. From the short-term perspective, we are deploying our 5-year capital budget. So rolling out new substations, new distribution feeders, all the different capacity projects that we've identified to mitigate a lot of those risks that we've reviewed previously in those tables on the previous slides. We are looking at piloting some non-wireless alternatives, which we're going to kind of showcase in our DSP filing here. And then through our secure portal that I alluded to previously, we're going to be providing a lot more information on that secure portal around host capacity for both load and generation. So that way customers can gain more insights into the system and make better decisions for their specific projects and needs. And then we're also evaluating different technologies to more dynamically manage the system. So whether that's through our DRMS pilot that we're kicking off here, through the whole virtual power plant efforts that we're working on, flexible interconnection pilots that we're working on. We're looking at all these different technology types and more effectively manage a distribution system so that way we can make sure that we're utilizing that capacity more efficiently. And then long term, as I mentioned, we're taking a more long-term approach from a planning standpoint to really address long-term capacity needs from a substation standpoint, since those are more of a long lead asset to implement. So really looking at where we need that capacity from a substation standpoint, trying to get ahead of that, try to, procure land ahead of time. So that way we're able to implement that project in a timely manner, as well as establishing potentially new capacity contracts and tariffs for reservation systems like our automatic throwover process. There's a lot of capacity on the system that is being utilized and reserved through the ATO contracts that we can't use to serve load since there's a contract in place to reserve that. So, we do anticipate reevaluating how that whole process is being handled and the rates around that. I'm going to pass this over to Zach here to maybe round out the rest of these bullet points here, unless there's any specific questions on the previous topics that I covered.
maybe just a few. As far as adding the results for load hosting capacity capabilities to like the DER hosting capacity. What's a projected kind of timeline for that? And then on what sort of interval do you expect that information to be refreshed?
Yeah, so admittedly, we've been having some challenges with the quarterly cadence that we're working on. We have a major load flow modeling software effort underway right now that'll be finalized this year. That'll give us drastically more capabilities around that. From a load and generation host capacity, we anticipate those being updated at the same time, essentially. Right now, we're pushing towards just providing the tabular data, the tabular results for the load host capacity and mapping the generation capacity. But we anticipate those being updated simultaneously once that portal's in place.
What additional is involved in mapping the load capabilities?
We've already built out that capability knowing that it's likely eventually coming, but from system security standpoint, we've been a little reluctant to actually map the loading information, which is why we're providing it just in that tabular perspective. But we are working towards that capability.
Could an interested developer or prospective customer utilize, first of all, access, and second of all, utilize the tabular information and understand what it means to them?
I think so. And we're providing some documentation on the portal to kind of help customers understand how to utilize that data. But if they're able to go to the generation map, figure out the feeders they're on, and then look in the tabular results, they can definitely identify what the min and max load host capacity for that specific feeder would be. So there's ways that the customers can utilize that information to be more informed around the capacity on the system for their specific needs.
How do they figure out what feeder they're on?
They can look at that through the hosting capacity maps. So on the new portal that we're rolling out, customers can search for an address. They can figure out which feeder they're on. They can see how they're being served by the distribution system. And then they can identify the feeder and then look at the spreadsheet tabular results and identify from a load perspective what that min and max capacity would look like.
Okay, so they'd have to cross-reference, like use the hosting capacity for DERs, basically figure out their feeder, cross-reference it to this tabular data.
Yeah, in a sense, yes.
Okay, and that would more or less show them what sort of capacity is left on a feeder?
Yeah, so for any given feeder, it would show what the minimum capacity is, so what the smallest amount on that feeder is, and then what the maximum is. So kind of knowing that range of the available capacity on the system, and that can help them identify, is that feeder really constrained, or is that feeder have a lot of capacity? They can kind of work through the nuances of that with that information.
And I'm just for my own processing of this information. I mean, I'm happy to hear. It sounds to me like a benefit to make load hosting capacity information available from a lot of what we heard last week, and just some of the frustrations with how these things change and how project teams can figure out what's going on and where they sit. But if I can look at the hosting capacity maps for, say, like intended for hosting capacity for solar, figure out what feeder I'm on, then cross-reference with the tabular data, to what degree don't I get to the same endpoint in terms of information as if you just made the load hosting capacity a map? Like, to what degree is that safer that I have to cross-reference but can get to the same endpoint?
I'm sorry, can you rephrase that question? Sorry.
No, that's fine. I'm trying to understand, you had mentioned you all aren't kind of prepared or not sure about making the load hosting capacity available in a map format. Is that fair?
Yes.
I think for security purposes, but you're also kind of saying you can use the solar hosting capacity map, figure out what feeder you're on by an address, get the information, then go to the tabular data and kind of get the same answer about load hosting capacity analysis eventually. And I was wondering, to what degree does that really provide more security if I can get to the same endpoint of information? It just takes me more time if I'm a customer. What is the delta in security there?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna kick this one over to Zach real quick for that response.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think the concern we have is how easy do we want to make this information available for somebody who may have nefarious intentions. So completely agree with your point. You can certainly do that cross-referencing yourself. But, you know, if you look at areas where we have high loading on our circuits, it's going to be a glowing red bullseye for somebody who wants to, you know, go target a substation or target a distribution asset. So while you can certainly get there using our data and what we're proposing to provide, I mean, there's tools out there where somebody can go use AI to go reconstitute our distribution system. We believe, at least right now, it's somewhat prudent to not make it as easy as possible for somebody to go inflict a targeted attack on a highly loaded area, as opposed to, you know, somewhere out in a rural area where we may not have a lot of significant infrastructure damage or any other, God forbid, loss of life or casualty to personnel. So that's our thinking there. But you're absolutely right, Commissioner Gilman. You can do the cross-referencing. We just think it's not prudent to do that and make it a, you know, glowing target for somebody.
So you don't want to make it a one-stop shop for the information.
That's exactly right. Well said.
And remind me again that the hosting capacity mapping as it stands today, and I think your recommendation for this tabular data are behind a login type of.
That's correct. I'm actually going to jump ahead because this is one of the slides that we're pretty excited about showing here. So we're in final user acceptance testing at the sake of getting a lot of software engineers really mad at me. But this is effectively what the request form is going to look like to access that secure portal. Pretty simple, just basic demographic information gathering. As we settled on in the DSP, this will link through to basically a click and sign NDA. There's really no review process. We're just making sure somebody's not going to type, you know, I want to blow up Excel's distribution grid into the comments box. Otherwise, people are going to get approved for this. And then you see on the right side of the tab here, maybe a little bit difficult to see, but those are the exposed feeder lines with the various hosting capacity. Everything's in kind of final testing here, so the color scales may change a little bit and it'll obviously be more visible, but we're pretty close to rolling this out and very excited about it that we can offer this information to our customers.
Okay, great. Any idea on availability date?
I think we're aiming to get this out like around end of quarter, if not early beginning of Q2. So again, we're just going through some final user acceptance testing to make sure there's no bugs in here as we roll it out.
Okay, thanks.
That's probably a good transition point to some of the longer term things we're doing here. So I don't know, let me pause there to see if there's any other questions, but we can just keep going otherwise.
I think that's it for right now.
Sure. So you've heard us talk about the 75% threshold. Again, the operational benefits of that from a flexibility perspective are pretty paramount. And I did want to clarify earlier that the loadings you saw for 2023, those were the 75% of the nameplate rating versus what's actually being observed on the feeder today, if that wasn't clear. So just wanted to put a finer point on that. But that offers a lot of benefits, both from a load and a generation perspective. Sure.
I was still confused, so thank you. So that is actual observed peak, what, like of the year versus the nameplate capacity of the equipment?
Exactly. So we have SCADA information for a lot of our distribution system that will register the highest historical values. So those are actually observed values versus what the 75% of the nameplate on the piece of equipment may be.
Okay, and those are observed values in 2023 versus nameplate.
That's correct.
Cool. So if we had efficiency and something dropped, maybe something dropped off the list.
Yeah, if you had a relatively flat load curve for an efficiency measure or something like insulation, you would see a slightly, you know, decreased amount of peak demand on that, depending what the ratio is, but of energy to demand.
That's helpful. Thank you. I am less confused. Thank you.
So that 75% planning threshold is really going to be critical to ensuring we're able to proactively meet our customer needs moving forward. We talked about a little bit before. The only thing that's kind of uncertain in the future is that there's going to be a lot of uncertainty around customer adoption of DER types that can influence the distribution load forecasts. So we think it's really critical, and I'll touch upon this in a few more slides, that we have a good margin to plan to that allows us to account for some of the uncertainties around the actions our customers may be taking. No forecast, regardless of what software planning tool we use like LoadSeer, is ever going to be perfect. So recognizing that we don't have perfect foresight, we think it's really critical that we start thinking about planning the system in a world where we don't have that perfect foresight in a way where we can still meet our customer demands and needs in a timely fashion. The other thing I wanted to highlight as well, sort of the middle bullet point here, is thinking about ways that DERs can support the system moving forward. Obviously, there's a lot of interest in virtual power plants. I think there's also a lot of ways we can think about reforming other DER structures today so that we can provide capacity benefits to the system. Mr. Mino touched upon that a little bit before, but one of the potential opportunities we see for improvement is around things like community solar gardens, where you basically get paid the same rate regardless of when and where you inject. And as we know from this presentation, the value of capacity in our system at different times of day is not going to be the same. So absolutely would entertain a conversation around how we can leverage DERs to provide more benefits to the system. And as we've highlighted also, a lot of this is going to be articulated in our 2024 DSP. But really, we see this as a critical inflection point for the company in moving out of those decades of paradigm shifts where we've seen low load growth and somewhat lower demand growth, to moving into an environment where we're more proactively planning for the system and the increasing demands on it. So let me pause there. I think that gets through the last of the bullets on the slide.
I think I'm good on this one. Thank you.
Perfect. Hit that one. So as we think about shifting towards our next DSP, some of the longer term foundational principles, there's really three that stand out to me, and I think more broadly within the company. Recognizing the shift in energy and associated demand that we're starting to see in some of our forecasts, I think it would be a little bit of a false truth to say that we're not going to need to invest in infrastructure. So that's really what bullet point number 1 is meant to indicate here. We are being asked to decarbonize those other two sectors of the economy, namely the built environment and transportation. So I think if we recognize that there is some foundational need to invest in infrastructure and use that as a foundational truth, that leads into bullet points 2 and 3 here. We need to do a better job or improve the way that we're maximizing the use of our existing and new infrastructure. A lot of that looks like asset health and reliability programs. So maximizing the use of what we put on the system today, better understanding the status and condition of it, and how we can potentially use that to limit or maximize the use of current and new investments. And then the last piece of this is, given the magnitude of investment that we think we're going to need to enable a lot of these policy goals, we really owe it and have an obligation to our customers to make use of cost-effective alternatives to investing in infrastructure. Because if we believe that we need to invest in the infrastructure, there's certainly going to be an opportunity to put downward cost pressure by leveraging things like NWAs, virtual power plants. And part of doing that is making sure that we're sending the right market and pricing signals to those alternatives. So that's probably a longer term conversation, but absolutely, and you'll see this as more part of our 10-year vision, but thinking about how we leverage new technologies and operational flexibility to improve how we plan and operate the grid, because we can't plan, much to Mr. Martz's earlier slide, to a grid that's linear and unidirectional. It's a lot more complex. So just planning deterministically is not going to be an option for the future. And we need to be making use and leveraging of technologies and alternatives to infrastructure that can help provide the services that our customers ask of us at an affordable rate. So just wrapping up here, I think this is our last slide, and then we'll pause for questions, get the rest of the team on here. But just a couple of key themes we're thinking about, and obviously we're going to share this with a lot of the stakeholders that have been key in influencing our previous DSP and that settlement agreement. But you heard this over and over again, but implementing design principles for a safe, reliable, and trustworthy system. And in the future, we feel like we're at that inflection point where we're not building the system for the next 5 years of the capital budget or the 10-year load forecast. But really, we need to be thinking about how we're building the system once for the next 30 years, because we have a lot of runway to get to those policy goals, but it's also going to feel like it's moving very quickly. Key focus, no surprise, I'm sure to you, but increasing the transparency of what's in our DSP. I will say, you know, having been one of the key architects in that, I think there's a lot of things we could have done better in the first DSP, but we also recognize that we had a lot of structure and process framework to establish there. So we're really hoping this next DSP is going to be focused more on the vision and less about the process and the framework of getting a filing stood up. We've touched upon load forecasting quite a bit, so I'm probably not going to say anything else more there. Touched upon the innovative grid technologies, but we absolutely see that being a part of our long-term journey and evolving our distribution system so that not everything we do requires infrastructure. Policy goals we've hit upon as well, so just seeing if there's anything else here. And then the last point too, which I think often goes unnoticed, but the analytic capabilities, the workforce capabilities to be able to plan the system to many of these new emerging and complex variables is certainly changing. So we really feel like we have an obligation to communicate to the commission, our stakeholders, exactly what it's going to take to be able to do this, both with our own internal employees, but also with the communities we serve, because there's a lot more engagement with those folks as well. So a little bit of a foreshadow of what you can expect to see in our future DSP, something we're meeting on weekly here and pretty excited about.
Excellent. And I think that's the conclusion of your presentation, right? Of your
That is
slide.
our last slide.
Excellent. Okay.
Stop sharing here.
No worries. Well, given the timing, I was going to suggest maybe we take a quick break and then we'll come back and get everyone on and maybe go through a few more questions if that works for you.
That sounds great. Appreciate the break.
Yeah, no worries. Why don't we come back at 3:15 and I have 2:56. So just over 15 minutes. We'll come back at 3:15 and then perhaps have a little more of a discussion, especially around what comes next. So I'll see you back at 3:15. Please keep in mind things will remain live during the break. So mute yourself, turn off the cameras if you can.
Appreciate that. See you in a few.
All right, welcome back. It's 3:15. Wondering, Mr. Martz, if you can help me get your team back online.
We just need one more minute, Commissioner Gilman, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Yep.
Thanks. All right, I think we are just about reassembled here. So I believe Mr. Martz and Mr. Minor should be on in a minute if you want to turn your cameras on.
Okay, perfect. Maybe I'll fire my first question if that works for you, Mr. Pollock, and we'll see who can field it. Just a couple questions to follow up, and happy to turn it into more a dialogue, but I had a jumble of notes that allowed me to organize a little better. So one thing I'd also like to understand, we've been focused almost entirely on the distribution system in this discussion, and just curious, any perspective you can give me on the relationship to the transmission system, and even more particularly like transmission constraints that we've heard of now. I don't think we need to get into all of the merits or anything that was dealt with elsewhere. But talk me through a little bit about kind of what is the relationship to also modeling of the transmission system, and kind of how that process looks, how you identify those issues, and how that relates to some of the issues that we're talking about here, especially as far as kind of causes and mitigation timelines.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll probably kick that one to Mr. Martz as he leads our entire team in integrated planning of generation, transmission, and distribution. So.
All right. Feedback. All right, let's try that again.
Maybe all there. Speakers have to be off.
All right, let's try that for a third time.
Sound better.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for bearing with the new normal, right, of Zoom and Teams feedback and interference. So happy to weigh in on that. And I just want to make sure I got the question correct, Commissioner Gilman. So you're asking about kind of the interplay, I'll call it, between the distribution and transmission system planning. And I think probably you're specifically getting at what you all just saw with the electric resource plan that was just filed in the 120-day comments.
Yeah, and I don't want to get into the merits of that. That's a separate proceeding, but just looking at the process in terms of how do you identify needs on the transmission system? How does that relate to needs on the distribution system? And kind of what are some of the core causes of what's coming up as far as constraints on that system, when they can be identified, and what mitigation looks like? Sure. So, and I might tag team Mr. Mino here a little bit, right? But I'll speak first to how the system planning works on the transmission level. I mean, obviously the main point of interconnection is the substation, right? So it's just kind of different. And I think the fungibility is the concepts are the same from like an engineering basis. It's inputs versus outputs, right? So on a distribution system, we're basically balancing generation inputs through the substations, and then they go through the feeder system into the customer meter and into customer usage. On the transmission system, basically the inputs are the actual power plants themselves. The transmission system is the an analogous feeder, if you will, right? And the load's actually the substation load. So as it pertains to the Colorado Electric Resource Plan, that's a pretty different but kind of related analysis. And specifically, the type of modeling that we did for the ERP was power flow modeling, and what that's really balancing
is all of the different resource types by fuel type, right? So wind, solar, gas, coal, etc. All of the generation coming onto the transmission network. And then what it's basically trying to do is it's trying to bring that load into the Denver metro area. And that was, one of the major things that we saw as we were contemplating the levels of resources from the solicitation was overall, irrespective of where the resources are. And as you know, we're adding a lot of renewable resources. The renewable resources are primarily in the plains area of the state. They're not within the Denver metro area. So the Northeast, the East, the Southeast, and then same with solar resources as well. And so what you all saw with the analysis that we did on the transmission system there is needing to make system or network upgrades in order to overcome the Denver metro import-export constraint. And so that was kind of one of the key things that we identified, is that with the level of renewable saturation that we're aiming to get to, that metro constraint has to be overcome in some way, shape, or form. And that was the network upgrades that we identified as part of the ERP. Now, how that kind of relates to the distribution, to the distribution side, right? That's basically showing up as load, which is a source of consumption on the transmission power flow models. So I'll pause there, and then maybe Dave, you can talk us through how we go from the substation load level down to the customer.
Sure. Any questions before that?
No, I'm just thinking through kind of the linkage, especially if you're moving on to these kind of far more robust modeling software, I guess, for the load side and the distribution side in LoadSeer, and how that kind of informs the planning on the transmission in terms of kind of understanding the timing of those loads, the flexibility of those loads, and then how that in turn impacts the power flow, that you have coming into Denver Metro, and kind of how is there a process to weave that all together? And then I think that the tangent off that is, if we're seeing now an uptick in load growth, which is what I'm hearing, that like load growth is accelerating, especially in certain areas, how does that influence, is there a discrete mechanism that influences the power flow modeling you're doing for a transmission project?
Yeah, so there's not a specific one-stop shop when it comes to tools to look at that interdependency between transmission and distribution, but there's a lot of, transmission and distribution planning work very closely together when it comes to both load and generation. So as the distribution planning team develops a 10-year forecast, we share that information with the transmission planning counterparts as inputs, as Steve mentioned, to their model, so they can count for that in their power flows and determine any issues on their transmission system. We also do that for DER as well, as we're reviewing interconnections for larger systems, and we start to see some backfeeding on the transmission system. We coordinate closely with them to evaluate the impacts of the transmission, the generation on the transmission system. So when it comes to, I'm sorry, can you repeat the rest of your question?
Does that only ever work? New question. Does that only ever work in one direction? So is the load necessarily only an input for the transmission, or is there ever a resultant transmission that you say, what else can we do on the load side to mitigate this? Does it ever pinball back and forth to come to kind of an optimized solution between the two, especially as we look down the road at VPPs or other ability to be much more proactive in managing load? Or is the transmission always the end state that everything just informs that and then it's over?
Yeah, happy to take that one. Deal with our feedback issues here. Hopefully that's a little better. Yeah, so I think it's a good opportunity to just reemphasize, we do have about 500 megawatts of DR capacity, so we're actively using that when we think about planning. To your point in question, though, absolutely, as we start to think about some of the technology that we're starting to enable and investigating at the distribution system, whether that be ADMS, DRMS, or DERMS, we have the ability to think about how we can leverage distribution resources, whether it be in a VPP context, an NWA context, and think about how we can flow that capability back upstream as either a bulk system resource or potentially even on the distribution system. So we're in the early days of that, just being completely transparent here. A lot of that is technology dependent, which we're starting to invest in and execute our roadmap in. But absolutely, that's really why our integrated system planning organization exists, is to break down some of those silos that, to your point, have historically existed between the very linear top-down model that we've used to operate the grid for over 100 years.
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, and what I'm trying to figure out is if we can intentionally flow the benefits up, which I think we can, whereas if you identify some major project needed on the transmission grid, can you say, okay, how do we use our distribution assets to either minimize or avoid that by deploying, one of kind of the load control mechanisms or something else to kind of intentionally avoid that? And just wondering, do you have kind of the processes in place to kind of do this iteration and try to understand, knowing, VPP and some of the ideas are much more early phase for you all, but like, is that part of the plan? Like, what sort of timeline are we talking about to be able to not just one directionally move information to the transmission system, but also say, well, that looks really expensive or like a very big project. What could we do on the distribution system to mitigate it very intentionally? Not just like, yeah, if we deploy a VPP across everything like peanut butter,
Sure.
but instead to say, like, in a targeted way, what if we target resources and loads in this area to alleviate a transmission concern? Like, what's the potential and timeline to have that optimization across those functions?
Yeah, I probably won't speak to the nature of the modeling, as it's really Mr. Martz's purview more than mine as far as looking across transmission generation. But I will say, regardless of whether the process exists today across the modeling, we have put in for a few different VPP applications as part of the GRIP funding with the DOE, with several other parties. Specific to Denver, I think that from what I understand, the magnitude of that transmission constraint is so large that it would be challenging for VPPs and DERs to fully solve that, but we're absolutely looking into whether it can provide some mitigation.
And is there, maybe Mr. Martz will get to this, but is there a plan to regularly include this sort of iteration or circular kind of planning discussion as we move forward, so that the first step is to figure out what we can do with these kind of load control mechanisms or other things, and the second stop is to then say we have a problem with X amount of dollars?
Yeah, so I'll weigh in, Commissioner Gilman. Can you hear me? I feel compelled to check just because we've had some challenges, so sorry for the redundancy. I think maybe I want to reset where we're at in the conversation. That bidirectionally, right, that does happen today. So inputs and assumptions absolutely flow between distribution and transmission, and from transmission into generation, and then all the way back through. So the degree that like we're capturing value through demand response programs or through DSMs or forecasting out, the impact that VPPs as an example could have, we're already capturing that today, like in that either distribution, transmission, or generation system analysis. So like going even all the way back to phase one for this last ERP, like those value streams are already being captured. I think one of the nuances we need to think about, though, is that location matters a lot. And it really has sizable impacts depending on which part of the system you're looking at. So as an example, there could be outsized impacts, I'll call it, in a positive way, outsized impacts to the distribution system. When you think about, DER saturation on the distribution system, there's a lot more locational benefit to things like batteries, VPPs, et cetera. As that gets aggregated together, though, that does not necessarily have, like a force multiplier effect at the generation level, because there can be different system constraints which are limiting the ability to capture all that value. So the way that I think about it is, to some degree, the megawatt level generation planning is somewhat interchangeable, but not always one for one. So that's, certainly something that we're working on. Obviously, there's not, a large scale, functioning VPP system yet really anywhere in the country, let alone Colorado. But let's just say, as a theoretical, we were to have one of those, like Zach said, we got we were awarded one of the group funding opportunities, and we saw that, actually occur on the distribution system. If that were successful, and let's just say, we gain 50 megawatts through that VPP program, absolutely that would be included into our inputs and assumptions for transmission, and that would be included into our inputs and assumptions for generation.
So that's helpful. And I think like the nuance I'm interested in understanding is to what extent there's locational intelligence on where, because you said location matters, and I agree, like location matters as far as what constraints you're making or breaking in a certain area. And so to what extent are you all able to consider, demand response or potential VPP interaction on a location specific basis to be targeted and to be kind of precise about here's where we'll gain the most benefits, rather than kind of spreading it like peanut butter as if the adoption is everywhere and we don't care economically where has more adoption. Does that make sense? Like, to what degree do you have any kind of locational intelligence in your targets for modeling?
Yeah, no, your question is a great one. I think that's part of the reason I'm in this role, is to help create like that synergy between the three commodities. To be really honest, I'm not prepared today to speak holistically to all the benefits of that yet, frankly, because that's still work in progress. So that's exactly, or I should say precisely, what I've tasked my team with, because I think that theme of, location matters is applicable to so many different topics. For example, how and where, we would like to see CSGs come onto the system, how and where we'd like to see, residential and feeder level battery programs develop. The way that we're going to, I think the best way for us to work with the commission and our customers is to get really tactical and focused on where the location is, because that's obviously where we're going to get the best priority of both value stacking, meaning achieving capacity, asset health, reliability, and other project drivers, aggregating all those together, as well as achieving the best cost benefits for these different types of resource classes onto our system. So again, I'm not prepared to speak to it, not because we didn't prepare it, just because it's still a work in progress. But the question that you articulated is exactly our goal.
And I think probably pushes on the question in the future for all of us to solve as far as what information about the system should be available where and to who and with what granularity, right? Because I think so many of the things we're talking about are pretty specific about the system as far as what we want to see, why, what are the constraints, what are the benefits, but it necessitates, I think, more information being available from you all. So we have to kind of address this security issue as far as what we can get to achieve, I think, the vision we're both talking about with this kind of locational intelligence of what assets we need where. We're probably going to have to make some progress on the issue of kind of confidentiality and who has access to what and what are the real security concerns with each, because it kind of just does a lot of this.
Yeah, apologize. I didn't mean to cut you off at the end. So agree with you, right? I mean, I think that needs to, transparency needs to be a critical principle to how we move forward. I mean, again, I'll kind of reiterate, I've been in this sector for 20 years, and it's been amazing to see the level of interest that our customers are taking. I think we're kind of gravitating towards a far more participatory type system, where you think about how our customers engage with the utility. It's no longer pay utility bill. It's, I'm going to adopt rooftop solar. I might engage in like a VPP program or a vehicle to grid program, things like that. So certainly agree with you. If we're going to be successful, beyond just PSCO, but successful within the state and the country at large, really leaning into electrification, transparency has to be critical. I would say, I think we're about, keeping pace. I'd say we're keeping pace with our peer utilities in terms of what level of system information we're currently offering. I wouldn't say that we're the best currently. I know there are some utilities that have put out more information publicly. I'd say to that, it's not necessarily our lack of desire. It's just we need to work with you all to find and strike that balance, because I certainly can't put the system at risk either. I think customers would be very upset if we were to make a misstep and risk, a cyber or physical security event. And given, the propensity of that happening and the geopolitical climate around world events, I think it would be imprudent to dismiss those as just academic exercises. Those are very real threats that we have to think about. So, you've got my personal commitment to, transparency has to be key. We have to make the right steps, but it has to be very measured.
Okay. I want to get back to a couple of questions around the 2022 DSP. So whoever the best for that. Last year's DSP. I think it was filed in 2022.
Yes, please proceed.
Was curious, we saw in your presentation earlier kind of a number of substations and a number of feeders, or both a number and percentage wise, that appeared to have some critical needs coming up, most of which in the short term. And I was curious, if we compare that to what was submitted in the 2022 DSP, how many of the substations and feeders that were identified in the 2023 comparisons you showed today in your slides, at being at that 75% plus utilization rate, how many of those were identified in the company's 2022 DSP in terms of the grid needs assessment or another place in the DSP?
Yeah, happy to take that one, Commissioner Gilman. So the information presented in the 2022 inaugural DSP was using 2020 loading data, just given the cadence of our forecasting process and when the filing was due. The information shared here was 2023 actual. So the data was completely different, right? So there was a 3-year gap between, what we filed in DSP and what we actually saw in the system last year. So I don't have an exact number of how many were identified. We could definitely pull that information if need be, but so it's not quite an apples to apples comparison, I would say, from that perspective.
Yeah, and look, I understand your processes are evolving quickly, it sounds like, which sounds like a good thing. But if we look back at like the DSP rules that kind of buttress that inaugural filing, with regard to the forecasting, forecasting was supposed to be a 10-year look forward with the base case for state policy goal implementation, which include a significant amount of electrification, especially for vehicles, and to identify both the short and long-term needs, short being 0 to 3 years and long being the above 3 to 10. So I would actually expect that many of these would have been identified with 2020 data if we're already at a critical point with them. So I don't know, maybe you can kind of respond to that fact, like, yes, the data is refreshed 3 years, but we should have been looking forward 10. So I'd still expect most of them to show up.
Yeah, and I would expect most of them to be represented there as well, just given, but I would say that the load growth that we've seen between the 2020 data and now is completely different. We're seeing a much higher uptick in that growth. So while I do, just knowing the system and knowing where these risks are, I do think that most of them were identified, but again, it's not quite an apples to apples comparison. Looks like Zach maybe wants to add a little more information there.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mina. The other point I think we talked about a little bit before, but that was a DSP that came quickly after the finalization of the rules. And I think we're trying to be clear about this in the filing, that it didn't give us an opportunity to run that forecast through our load tier process. In fact, there's several settlement terms around things we're going to do with load tier moving forward. So many of the drivers that we talked about early on in our presentation today aren't captured in that planning forecast. But that's absolutely one of the things that we're rolling into our next planning forecast to make sure that we're better positioned to meet those needs moving forward.
Okay, so different forecasting software. But with regard to the forecast, as Mr. Mino is kind of describing it, y'all have seen load growth that exceeds your forecast from the inaugural DSP. Is that a fair characterization?
Yes.
Generally, that's correct. I can't comment on the exact magnitude on it. We'd have to go back and do some analysis on it, but I think that's generally a fair statement. And we can absolutely provide those a follow-up if helpful. Okay.
And although that forecasting was maybe not perfect, not in load tier, first attempt, forget it, all the asterisks, but it was, I think, your best attempt at the time to model the state policy objectives in terms of uptake. So when I combine those two things, what I'm hearing is, your best attempt to model with older tools and whatnot. And we are actually moving faster on load growth than your best attempt to model what load growth would look like in hitting the state policy objective.
So we ran the forecast outside of the forecast where we actually plan our system to using that 2020 data, again, because we're using 2020 information. That is, just to emphasize again, that is the key change we are making with this upcoming DSP, is to roll that into our base planning forecast. But given the timing challenges and where we were with the annual forecasting and budgeting process, we did not have adequate time to incorporate the state policy forecast into the actual forecasting process that was used to identify mitigation. So there's a little bit of a one-time disconnect there, just given the finalization of the rules and when we actually filed our DSP.
Okay, and apologies if my memory does not serve me correctly, because it feels like this is all in dog ears to us, right?
There was a lot in that first DSP, so no fault at all.
A lot that's happened since. Okay, so I guess in that characterization, it wasn't really exactly a forecast that you think probably represented state policy goal achievement.
That's correct. Yeah, the forecast of state policy was created after we had our planning forecast to understand what those impacts would be.
Okay. Do you currently have a forecast that you are using internally that in any way considers the state policy goals?
To some extent, I don't know the exact levels. I'll just get back to you on that, but certainly not at the levels that we've indicated really being that inflection point. And again, that's really what we're diligently working through for our next DSP, is to make sure we've got something that's more consistent and aligned with those state policy goals.
Okay, yeah, because like what I'm trying to add up in my head is we have this forecast that wasn't quite modeled on the state policy goals in the previous DSP. Then we saw load growth significantly in excess of what was in your internal forecast, which I guess maybe a business as usual or something you might call it. And so I'm curious if you have done any sort of look back or analysis. Okay, what if in loads here that was modeled to more state policy parameters? Are we more or less tracking with what that forecast would have been? Since it sounds like that would have been more aggressive than what your forecast was.
I think that directionally that's correct. I'm not aware that we've done that type of analysis, largely because we're so focused on actually building out the forecast that we're going to plan our system to, inclusive of those goals.
Yeah, just trying to understand, like, from any sort of analysis of what has happened, if we looked back over the past several years, have we actually been pretty close to what we would have been had we used state policy goals? And then obviously in my head, I'm kind of linking that to the idea that you all have this other forecast that isn't state policy goals, that is somewhat less aggressive, and trying to figure out, are we going to recreate a little bit the same problem we had the last time in undershooting with your forecasting if we get closer to the state policy goals?
I don't think so. I can say pretty confidently with my boss on the line here that internally we've come to the decision that we absolutely need to be incorporating this into our forecasts and our forecasting process. I think where you may see some interesting data points in this next DSP is understanding what the high growth scenario looks like, understanding how state policy looks in the base forecast, and potentially any other forecast we may consider to run. But it feels like we're, at least from my perspective, we're having a little bit of an incomplete conversation until we get that data to the commission and our other stakeholders.
Yeah, I agree. I'm trying to put all the pieces together and hypothesize like where we are and where we're going here. And I know part of the reservation you had kind of communicated about it, putting the lowest forecast, I guess, in the DSP or in what you're actually planning to at the state policy goals, is that hypothetically could overshoot and you could invest more than is needed, right? Like I think you brought up that looks expensive on the distribution system. Is that?
I think that's the challenge. I mean, it's really, it kind of comes down to being a policy decision, but I think we recognize in evolving our forecasting process, there's a lot more uncertainty and a lot more variables. Some of those variables we don't have great insight into because they're ultimately customer driven decisions. And when you couple that with the magnitude of the load requests we're seeing from customers today, where we might be seeing 10 or 15 megawatts, whereas historically it was a few hundred or maybe 2,000, 3,000 kW. All of that, kind of raises the question of, do you plan the system exactly to your forecast, or is there some subjective judgment that goes along with that as well? Because we're seeing things evolve so dynamically that it would be a complete lie to be up here and say that we're going to nail our forecast every time. And given the number of confounding variables there, I think it's ultimately at the commission's discretion of how proactive we want to be in that forecasting process. But absolutely, it's our obligation to make it as best and defensible as we can and incorporate those variables going forward. But not to say it's always going to be right, but we think it can always be defensible.
Yeah, just trying to think through kind of the scenario as we look. I totally agree with you. I mean, this electrification could show up relatively quickly, and so it feels a little difficult to anticipate. But that's one of the reasons it would be good to kind of look back and say, well, what actually happened over the past few years, and is it pretty close to what it would have been if we did the state policy goals? But also, I think it would be helpful to understand, this is a pretty dynamic situation as far as cost, because there's the investment, there's the cost in these distribution system upgrades to kind of meet this electrification and just other ambient load growth. But also there's a ton of additional sales that come with that, right? In terms of kind of buttressing that investment, which I think we probably all agree, depending how that new load does or does not coincide with your existing system peaks, could provide downward pressure on rates, given just the enormous amount of additional kWh you might be selling. And so it would be helpful, I think, as part of this discussion, I'm just kind of thinking as we go, like as we look at DSP and as we look at what these future investments look like under these different scenarios, to also like understand a little bit from a rate perspective what that means, right? Because I mean, I understand to some extent if we are proactively building it, we're not 100% sure it's paired with more sales, right? But the hard bet here is that it is to substantiate these increased sales. And so it's so hard to talk about investment in a vacuum when we're not talking about more like rate impact of what does this look like if this is substantiated with the load growth that is expected under these scenarios. So just to kind of put that in your heads for DSP, like for me, it's so hard to look at it in isolation as if it won't, help be substantiated by increased sales, which I think is the main thought.
Yeah, absolutely agree from a capacity perspective. I think the other consideration here as well is we talked a little bit about asset health and reliability investments. That doesn't necessarily correspond to capacity or increased kilowatt hour sales. We're also looking at additional resiliency and hardening of our system. I think the commission is well aware of our wildfire mitigation activities, but we're looking across those other capital buckets to make sure that if we're looking at a capacity project, for example, what are the other benefits we might be able to layer on from a resiliency perspective? So in other words, if we're looking to underground a feeder for wildfire, is there an opportunity to also go to a larger conductor size and get a capacity benefit? So we're really trying to maximize the stewardship of our customer dollars by looking across things that may not just be specifically driven by capacity needs.
Okay, that's helpful. And I just want to clarify, it's kind of a question from last Monday, and perhaps I'm confused in my own head, too much going on. When the company does the conceptual capacity checks before you get an actual application for new service, it was my understanding there was not like an official tracking of those to try and identify hotspots on the system where you're seeing like potential for a lot of new growth. They're just not fully, developed in their plans yet. Help me clarify in my own mind. Are you all tracking in any way the conceptual capacity checks in terms of location, load size, and potential timing of the loads?
Probably direct that one to Mr. Mino here, so let me mute myself.
Sorry to make you go back and forth.
Yeah, so internally we do track them. We don't count for them necessarily in our forecast or when we're considering new actual service applications to the distribution system, but to get an idea of where we anticipate hotspots, to your point, and to where we think we're going to need additional, especially like when it comes to substation capacity, we do take those into account to a certain extent, but we don't necessarily layer them into our forecast from that perspective, given that there's uncertainty whether or not they'll come to fruition or not. If there's certain projects that are pretty far along their development process and they're just not quite ready to actually apply yet, we'll factor those in. But like we mentioned last Monday, we get a pretty wide array of projects and at various stages of being ready to apply for service, and we have to kind of use our judgment as to whether or not we're going to account for those or not.
Okay, so so you had said they're not included in your forecasting, but could be included for like consideration of future projects. I'm kind of unclear how it could not be one but the other. Like I thought the forecast was what was used to identify future projects and kind of substantiate them. So if we're not including them in the forecast, how do sometimes substation projects kind of taken into account?
Yeah, so I'll set that one back. So, like if they're far along and they're actually have like development plans and they're starting the permitting process, we'll factor those into the forecast. So I'll correct what I said previously. But it doesn't necessarily mean we account for them across the board, given how much variability there is with them. But for area, especially, also depends on the magnitude of them too. If they're smaller applications and they're not quite as impactful, a lot of that gets accounted for when we factor in our corporate growth forecast, especially to round out the outer years. For large conceptual projects that are a little more certain that they're going to go forward, we will factor those in, and that kind of helps round out our forecast and risk analysis. So there's kind of a mix there. It really depends on the application and what stage they're in and how impactful we anticipate that being.
Okay. But like at large, I mean, the vast majority of kind of once you give them back the results, it kind of dies there until you get an actual application.
Yes and no. Also, I mean, something that we're also working towards this year is how do we take those conceptual capacity checks and round out some of the propensity models within our low SEER tool. So if we get conceptual capacity checks that we think will eventually come, we can bump up the propensity for adoption, whether that's, vacant land that could be developed or electrification demand that could be adopted. We're trying to adjust our propensity models from when we allocate like a high level system-wide forecast to somewhat capture those that we're not necessarily directly incorporating into the forecast.
Okay. Yeah, and I think given this and our discussion last Monday, I'm just seeing probably a value in at least tracking them. So you have some basis on, okay, we're seeing a huge uptick in this area or this, because at some point, even though they might not be giant and they might not be really far along, a massive uptick in a certain area probably affects your propensity in that area, right? So like, it seems to me it would be valuable to have maybe a more formalized tracking to understand, first of all, how many of these come to fruition, like how many of them come through. At some point mathematically, you can probably figure out how much you trust certain amount of these you put out for your forecasting on the system.
Yeah, so we do track them. It's just whether or not they're incorporated in the forecast. So like we're aware of them, we review them, and then how we incorporate that into the forecast or how we adjust our propensity models is really dependent on the specific application in question.
Okay. Let me see. Okay. So I had another question, but I think it's been fully answered, which was, is the growth that you're now experiencing in excess of what you had planned for in the 2022 DSP forecast? And I think the answer was a fairly resounding yes. Is that across the board or only in pockets where growth is significantly exceeding your 2022 DSP forecast?
I don't have all the specifics around that in front of me right now. We didn't do that retroactive analysis, but we are aware of major load centers that we're counting that were also identified within the DSP and others that have materialized since then. So it's a little bit of both, I would say.
Okay, so it's possible some areas are more or less on track with your forecast and certain areas are exceeding.
I would suspect, yeah. Like I said, we would have to double check that, but I would suspect that it's a little bit of both.
Okay. And it sounded like Mr. Martz had identified before kind of the giant loads that you've seen, like related to maybe data center, oil and gas. To any other extent, have you been able to like identify where you're seeing big growth in terms of, are there specific drivers? Are there local policy drivers or incentives or other things going on in these areas that are causing faster than expected growth?
Sorry, I didn't hear the whole question. Can you repeat that, please?
Yeah, sure. So just Mr. Martz had identified some specific kind of very large load types like data centers, oil and gas, electrification.
Hmm.
That seems to be influencing, especially rural areas, that second. But to the extent you're seeing quicker than anticipated growth in other areas of the system, have you all been able to attribute it to a specific source or issue? Are there certain policies? Is it primarily population growth? Is it primarily electrification? Like, have you all been able to identify why there are certain pockets that have significantly exceeded your forecasting?
Not necessarily a specific customer type or anything like that. I think that some areas have seen quicker adoption than they have historically that maybe we didn't fully capture in our forecast. There's areas in the northern part of our service territory, around like, for example, like Fort Collins, around there. We don't serve Fort Collins, but areas around it that have grown very quickly, significantly quicker than they have historically. So some of those trends, we're starting to get a better grasp around and making sure that we're accounting for in our planning process. There's also major redevelopments that we're being brought into the loop with, such as downtown redevelopments that are underway for downtown Denver. So there's definitely pockets of areas that are just really have the ability to really blow up in terms of demand growth. But I don't know if it's necessarily attributed to a specific like customer type or something, anything like that, like large customer type.
Okay. Yeah, and then as I understand it, as you move forward with your load steer modeling, you'll be able to kind of influence this propensity, if you will, for like electrification or something like that to impact load and capacity in a certain area. I guess how locally are you planning on doing that analysis?
It's down to the premise level for.
I'll try to figure out the difference in propensity.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, sorry.
Yeah, so I mean, we're modeling this down to the individual premise level in terms of the propensity for adoption. So each individual building, we're bumping up the propensity to adopt certain technologies. We're also accounting for vacant land that has the ability to be developed, as well as other technology types that could be adopted at different areas. So we're getting pretty granular with it, which is inherently challenging as well, because your likelihood for being wrong about that specific building adopting a certain technology goes up. But it gives us a general trend in terms of different areas and different regions in terms of what we anticipate the overall growth to be and how that will impact the distribution system.
Okay, so it's not, I mean, it sounds like you have the ability to go down to the premise level. I don't actually see you guys going into like 1.4 million like things and hitting a new button. So realistically, are you going to like, okay, city and county of Denver has certain building codes, certain incentives for electrification. I'm going to pick all the commercial buildings here and go with a certain propensity? Or is it even like, how do you decide how granular you'll get? Like, it seems infeasible to go to every premise.
Yeah, we're actually working through some of those nuances currently. We're rounding out what we call our base forecast, which is accounting for some of those technologies. So we are getting down to the individual buildings level in terms of what we anticipate from a propensity to adopt certain technologies. And then the load steer program, takes into account different socioeconomic factors, different, there's a few different factors that it takes into account as it makes that determination as to which individual premises is going to allocate adoption to for each year for each different technology type. So we try to influence it, and then we rely on this statistical methodology for allocating those technologies to the individual premises and open land that could be developed and things like that.
Okay. As part of that, does that load steer or that kind of forecasting engine on propensity, do you take into account the age of the property?
The age of the property?
Yeah, which I mean is a major indicator of efficiency and to some extent mechanical system probably.
We don't specifically that I'm aware of. I have to double check to see if that's something that load steer has a data source that it's able to import around that. I think it may, but I don't know for certain, so we'd have to double check that.
Okay. I mean, it seems to me also so much as age is big driver of efficiency would probably have some bearing on the peak too, and how frequently,
Absolutely.
how
Yeah,
fungible
it
the
definitely
peak.
does. I apologize. I didn't mean to cut
No,
you
that's
off.
fine. Just like how major the peak is and how fungible the peak is. Clearly, with a more efficient building, you can shift peak pretty easily with something like a VPP because you're just going to hold the heater, cooler, whatever you're doing. Versus like a less efficient building shell, it feels like you have far less opportunity to move the load. And so, just wondering like how much I can expect from loads here. How much is of this can be accounted for, like with building age or something else, in terms of how smart we are about what might happen on the system.
Yeah, so I mean, admittedly, we're continually evolving load steer's functionality, and we're directly influencing where they steer their product given our needs around distribution planning. While I don't know for certain around the age of the buildings, we are building out points that we can allocate these demands to for areas that we anticipate gentrification and things like that to hit. So we're trying to kind of work towards that in another fashion to a certain extent, but it's continually evolving, and we're constantly pushing them and to evolve their tools so we can get more sophisticated with our planning process as well.
Mr. Pollock, maybe to add in that it might also, I don't know, to me, it's possible age of the building affects their propensity to say like change their mechanical system or something like that. Like if they have a bunch of other stuff, if they need a new roof and they need a new whatever, there's only so much money each building has, it would seem to me. But go ahead, Mr. Pollock.
Thank you. Yeah, at the sake of being obvious here, I think one thing we want to point out is that there's not one modeling solution that will solve every need. So we have had some conversations exactly around the points that you're raising around thinking about building stock, demographics at a more local level, if we were to go design a more targeted type NWA or VPP solution. Because to your point, those two things do matter when you're really trying to do that very granular premise-based bottom-up build to meet a very specific need. I think the challenge is with LoadSeer, that tool is really designed to have a replicable, repeatable process for modeling 800 different distribution feeders with multiple DR types and load curves. So I think it will provide a lot of value, but it's not going to solve every question that may be out there.
Sorry, you just piqued my interest when Mr. Mino said premise level. I'm like, whoa. What are we really gonna do here? Let's see. Yeah, so we talked a little bit about kind of how we figure out the stacking of benefits of certain measures, or especially locationally certain actions. And just kind of try to open a dialogue on here when we look at whether it's VPPs or other demand response, demand flexibility programs, or even, distributed solar and storage on the system. How do we get smarter about how we evaluate the stacking of benefits, especially given the processes before the commission, where we have one that's like DSM related and one that's about distribution investments, and then something else, transmission investments come as one-offs, and then we have this whole process around generation. And like, how do we get much better at understanding kind of structurally in the processes, that we can see things, how we stack, how we value things, and then stack the benefits kind of across all of these different areas as we move forward?
Yeah, great question. I can offer up a few anecdotes from my experience in other states. I think on the bulk side, it's relatively straightforward. I think we've done a decent job of characterizing what the benefits can be there. I think one of the challenges we see before getting into distribution here is just understanding from a resource perspective, when we move some of those resources that we're talking about potentially being as part of VPP, really from the load side of the ledger into the supply side of the ledger. How does that interact with other resources from an effective load carrying capability perspective? So just understanding how those will perform in a very broad and high magnitude renewable variable energy system like we have in our system, and we're going to further. So I think that's probably the biggest question on the load side. We've got some internal modeling that our integrated system planning, modeling, and analytics team is working on to help answer that question. On the distribution side, I think, in my view, and I base this upon a lot of experience in New York State, the recognition of that, the value of a DER in the distribution system is going to be different depending on when and where it is. So one way the New York utilities went about doing that is by creating marginal cost of service studies for different parts of the system. So that could be planning regions, it could be by substation, but that really gets to the heart of the question of what value can a DER provide or not provide to certain parts of our system. We talked about it a little bit before, but adding solar capacity, especially CSG capacity, out in rural areas where we don't have a lot of capacity constraints is not going to provide as much value than, say, putting in a smaller system on the outskirts of Denver where it might potentially be able to be sited, but not at like 4 or 5 megawatts like we see in some of the rural areas. So I think marginal cost studies can provide a lot of value. When it gets to more product specific perspective, I think we've done a lot of that on the NWA front, but certainly there's always opportunity for improvement there. But I think it really starts with the recognition of that, the time and place on the distribution system, you can't use the same value universally because as we see today, there's too many variables that are changing that value, both in a snapshot in time, but more critically over time as we see new resources impact those loads.
Yeah, and I think we, just trying to think through the work we have to do, even when we look at like non-pipe alternatives in terms of the impact of the electric system, if we see, say discrete electrification in one area, first of all, understanding what business as usual even looked like for upgrades in that area. It sounds like our forecasting has been slow thus far, right? So that delta is probably bigger than it realistically might be, if we had forecasting keeping pace with kind of the ambient levels of growth on the system. But then also looking at, should we be pairing, battery storage or some other solution like in these areas to lessen the cascade of costs, right? And like to get much more dynamic across all of these systems about how we're addressing and really optimizing costs across every area. So I don't know the perfect idea or how we do it, but like looking at everything in a silo and pretending nothing else matters or influencing it is not the most gratifying. So just trying to figure out, like, even when we're looking at something like MPA, should we also be looking at, well, what does it look like if you had X amount of storage in that section of the grid or something like that to help figure out in total, how do we deliver the best value for ratepayers? So
absolutely. Again, back to the sort of the ethos of our integrated system planning group, we are having those types of conversations today to achieve exactly the outcomes that you're alluding to here. So some of our MPA analysis, we've got our distribution planning team actively involved in those conversations so that we can understand what some of the impacts are going to be in the distribution system, as well as identify potential opportunities to help mitigate that. So yeah, it's a great point. And again, we're just getting started here, but we're pretty excited about the challenge of trying to do that.
Okay. Maybe one more question. I hate to commit. I always have a lot of questions, but as we look at the workforce requirements of this, like I completely understand that the planning process is getting much more complicated. You're seeing a huge uptick, as I hear, in applications for new service, the size of the new service, in solar interconnections. And so just understanding, I mean, we can have the best planning in the world, but if we don't have the humans to be processing these requests and kind of churning through it, we're bound to get delays in kind of meeting the expectation anyway, even if we get our forecasting on point. So given this increase in demand, just curious from you kind of how staffing levels in these departments are now compared to how they were, 2 years ago or something before this kind of massive uptick. And then, maybe that's the first question.
I'll probably defer that one to Mr. Martz, who happens to also be my boss. He's probably the best position to answer that.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Pollock. Can you hear me, Commissioner Gilman?
Yep.
All right, great. Sorry, I'm going to keep checking. So yeah, I mean, that's certainly a question we're looking at right now. To Zach's point, I just want to actually maybe add a little bit to the last question, if that's okay, just to visit on that for a second. I mean, I think that's the benefit we're already seeing with integrated system planning, right? So I'll just use the ERP as an example. As we're able to see, network challenges, we have the ability to, like you said, kind of bust down silos just naturally with the way that we're organized, and ask those other questions, right? Which, in full transparency, I don't think that we've always done a great job of doing. So I think we're already starting to reap the benefits of that. When we're thinking about how we're scoping, scoping up our DSP and kind of the next evolution of budget, absolutely, we're in the forefront of the driver's seat, or I'd say we're in the driver's seat, really putting together these types of analyses to say, okay, what's better? Distribution level battery programs, or do we want to seek, generation, at a larger scale within the metro constraints? So like we're able to ask those questions and really evaluate the full set of trade-offs that come along with investing in any one singular commodity, if not looking across the full value chain. So back on staffing, sorry for the quick tangent. On staffing, we're certainly looking at the volume of customer requests that we're getting in, which includes both conceptual capacity checks, formal capacity checks, and then solar interconnection requests, in addition to other planning functions that we play in terms of evaluating the system. So it's something in flight. I can't cite a specific number or an easy metric to say that, one FTE planning resource is good for 200 capacity checks as an example. I don't have those analytics in front of me. That's something we could follow up with. But I don't think that staffing levels are necessarily the exact regulator or the governor of speed of resolution for distribution issues. I think one topic we haven't touched a lot on today, and I want to be really clear. I mean, we fully own our supply chain challenges, but that is one large scale challenge that's affecting the entire industry, is the role of supply chain and permitting. And so I think that's a significant, when you think about the speed of remediation and the speed of, pick a forecast, low, high, or extremely high, some of that starts to not matter because ultimately we're limited by how fast we can build infrastructure. And right now, the two most pressing issues we have are supply chain and permitting. So you look at even just like the basic electric equipment that we have to procure to provide just basic service, load serving transformers, switchgear, reclosers, et cetera. There's very few parts and components that I'm aware of that don't have lead times measured in multiple quarters, if not years. And then same with permitting, right? So when Zach actually kind of pressed upon the CSG example, I mean, that's a great example of kind of like the cost versus risk versus speed interplay, wherein, right, I think there's a lot of incentive to look at CSGs and other DER installations like that well outside the city limits because permitting is faster and it's also cheaper. That does not impact the system, though, in the same way that something like siting a new substation can. The challenge with that is that putting a new substation in takes 4 to 5 years, as an example, right? So I just want to stress that staffing levels aren't the only regulatory feature here in terms of the speed of remediation. There's other things that we're balancing as well.
Got it. Yeah, perfect. I've got that. And as far as like permitting timeline for a new feeder, what's that typically look like?
You're asking if permitting timelines are about a year?
Do you need permitting for a new feeder, and how long does that typically run?
I mean, I'd be remiss if I gave you a singular number to think about for permitting. I mean, permitting is a highly variable space, and we can accomplish some permitting in a matter of weeks and months when it's straightforward. But something like procuring land for a new substation can take multiple years. I mean, beyond just the actual acquisition of land, moving into the permitting space, the site and civil work that we have to meet, the environmental requirements, that can take multiple years. So rough numbers, a substation, would take several years to acquire the site and start to construct. Undergrounding feeders, would also take several years. Just the locates for undergrounding, as an example, right now takes 6 to 9 months. So there's a lot at play in terms of how long the permitting and land and siting activities take.
Okay. Got it. So I'm seeing when maybe I'm putting together something for myself, but like if we're undershooting the forecast, or if we're forecasting low, our problems seem to kind of multiply, and then we're behind by a lot because we haven't even begun these planning. And I know the forecast can't be perfect, but it seems as though if our forecast is low, things get much more delayed, given the delays that you indicated for equipment and permitting.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. I mean, I think that's a risk, to be sure. I think the thing we've got to think about with you all at the commission is just as we bring forward forecasts and we ask for investment, I think we need parity with you all in terms of the cost recovery piece that's commensurate with the forecast. I think that's where there's some tension, if you will, around the degree to which we forecast, right? Because it's obviously our goal to be good stewards of our customers' money and how we think about affordability and bill impact. So the engineer part of me wants to say that, you know, I'd love to start planning for a much higher level of margin, right? Say 50% margin on the system everywhere. But that's a piece that we don't think that we can move that fast due to affordability challenges with how much infrastructure that would require. So that's what you kind of heard from Mr. Pollock earlier is we're taking a little bit more of a disposition of what I call aiming a little bit higher on our load forecast, because I completely agree with you. I think you'd be in an echo chamber, frankly, with me in terms of, we have to start to get in front of that. The cost recovery piece has to be on equal footing with that. But if that's something that we can work with the commission on, we're right there with you. Beyond that, right, then the next thing that regulates us is the speed of build out, the permitting, the supply chain, all those other exogenous factors.
Got it. Let's see. I think those are really my only questions that I have, but I don't know anything else you all wanted to add or wrap with, but I have gotten through the questions I had here for the day.
No concluding remarks from us other than just expressing our gratitude and just thanking you for the opportunity to participate. Again, hopefully you're seeing us really lean into being transparent with you all, and just know that that's an ongoing commitment from us. We'll work with you the best that we can. We'll certainly concede we don't necessarily have every answer all the time, but hopefully you're seeing us demonstrate, extreme interest to work with our customers and really lean into where we're going with this grid. It personally excites me. I think it's pretty phenomenal. And we have a wonderful opportunity set here as a country to really think about the clean energy revolution. So thank you for creating the avenue for this and the discussion.
Yeah, and thanks very much to your team for joining us today. Mr. Davis, Mr. Sarah for supporting us on the Christian side. And I think we have Ms. Kunkel with us today. We were missed to forget. But thank you to them. And I agree with you. I think exciting times, but a period of very intense transition when we look across the gas system, the electric system, as far as what we're expecting for forecasting. So I know a lot of questions for me around forecasting, but it's really a recognition that, we've got to get as close to we can at nailing it and really having a cohesive look across all these proceedings, across all of these systems in terms of what we think we'll see happen. This necessarily implicates what will happen on the gas system, what will happen with electrification of vehicles and these other factors, so that we can ensure certainly that we're not standing as a barrier to beneficial electrification and achievement of state policy goals, but of course doing so in a way that really utilizes as much kind of data and evidence-based information as we can to ensure we're good stewards for ratepayers' money, as well as I think deploying a lot of the newer technology that we talked about today to ensure that we're making the most of any investments that are made, essentially with that ratepayers' money, to ensure that we're really fully utilizing every bit of the system to the extent we can before we come back and ask for something new or do something new. So really appreciate you engaging with me today on this discussion. I'm working on, I think we're going to work on, I had talked about last Monday, the potential for a third workshop on cost allocation, specifically around those grid upgrades, kind of up to the substation level. that sometimes fall upon customers when they're asking to connect new load and kind of bump over what capacity is available. We are trying to plan that for the 22nd in the afternoon, similar time frame. So working on that, you'll probably see something forthcoming on that, but to the extent that the audience for this overlaps quite a bit, maybe some advance notice that's what we're working toward, the 22nd of this month, to host that workshop on that. I think we had a lot of discussions last Monday that it's so intertwined with the process and kind of when that kicks off, the actual inclusion of those in your forecasting and the distribution system needs. So we tried to get that done in pretty short order so we could keep all of these discussions kind of grouped and really get a lot of those kind of thoughts processing and together at more or less the same time. I know it's a demanding set of meetings for everyone, including myself and my staff, but I think it's important to get it done as quickly as we can so we really understand how we can continue to make these processes better, work better for the customers as we move forward. So appreciate you all's support in being able to attend that in pretty short order, and we will continue to work on scheduling that, but just wanted to give that notice. And I saw a thumbs up, so it looks like your team's ready, willing, and able on the 22nd. Okay, cool. Well, thanks again to you all for the information. Really very much appreciated. I'll kind of digest this. I may request some more detailed information, like in terms of the maps or other information, to really ensure I have a full view of what we're talking about here and where we're going. But this has been very informative to me, especially in anticipation of a DSP at the end of this year that we anticipate to be, you know, a pretty big leap, I think, from the first DSP in terms of all of your analytical capabilities and what you'll be presenting. So this has been very helpful to better understand how some of this will be incorporated there, and the current state of things as we see them right now. So just wanted to thank you all again. And with that, we will conclude today's workshop. Thanks so much.
Thank you.